Hey guys, tonight we venture into the legendary story of Roboute, Guilliman, the Avenging Son and Lord of Ultramar, the noble Primarch who, against impossible odds, built the most prosperous realm in human space. From his discovery on Macragge to his miraculous return in humanity's darkest hour, his story is one of duty, honor, and unwavering leadership. So, before we dive into the warp, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're interested in God of War lore, do visit my channel, Spartan Slumber. I've added the link in the description below. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore the galaxy's darkest secrets. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey through the stars together. In the grim darkness of the far future, when hope itself has become a forgotten whisper, when the Imperium of man teeters on the precipice of total annihilation, there stands one figure whose very name can rally 1 billion souls to fight against the dying of the light. Roboute Guilliman, the 13th son of the Emperor, the architect of humanity's greatest realm, the warrior who conquered not through destruction, but through creation itself. Picture this moment, if you will. The galaxy burns. Cadia, the fortress world that has stood against chaos for 10,000 years, finally falls. The Great Rift tears reality apart, splitting the Imperium in two. Daemon armies pour through wounds in space itself. The Astronomicon, humanity's guiding light, flickers like a candle in a hurricane. This is the hour when even the most faithful begin to whisper that perhaps the Emperor has finally abandoned them. But in a chamber deep within the Temple of Correction on Macragge, something impossible happens. Ancient Eldar technology hums with power. Wraithbone constructs channel energies older than human civilization, and in a pool of liquid light, a figure begins to stir. For the first time in 10 millennia, the Primarch's eyes open. Yet this moment of resurrection is merely the culmination of a tale that spans 11,000 years of triumph, betrayal, death, and rebirth. It is the story of the only Primarch who truly understood that conquest without governance is meaningless, that strength without wisdom is mere brutality, that an empire built on fear alone cannot endure. Guilliman stands apart among his brothers, not because he was the strongest warrior, though few could match his blade. Not because he was the most beloved, though entire sectors would die for him. Not even because he was the most successful conqueror, though his campaigns brought more worlds into compliance than any other, save Horus himself. No, Guilliman's true genius lay in something far more profound and lasting. While his brothers conquered worlds, he built civilizations. While they commanded armies, he created institutions that would endure for millennia. While they won battles, he won the peace that followed. The 500 worlds of Ultramar stand as testament to this vision. Even in the 42nd millennium, when the rest of the Imperium has descended into a nightmare of bureaucratic madness and religious extremism, Ultramar remains a beacon of what humanity could become: efficient government, educated populations, thriving trade, technological advancement. Here, in this corner of the galaxy, the Emperor's original dream still lives. But how did this come to pass? How did an infant cast into the void by the Chaos Gods become the savior of human civilization? How did the foundling prince of a single world become the architect of an empire that would outlast the stars themselves? The answer begins not with glory, but with murder. Not with triumph, but with betrayal. Not in the halls of power, but in the blood-soaked sand of an arena where a young man learned that evil often wears the face of a trusted friend. For you see, even before he knew his true nature, Even before he commanded legions of transhuman warriors, Guilliman faced the choice that would define his entire existence. When corruption infects even those closest to you, when the very foundations of justice crumble beneath political ambition, do you retreat into cynicism and despair? Or do you stand firm, rebuild what was broken, and create something stronger than what came before? On a night 10,000 years before his resurrection, when he was still just Roboute, ward of Consul Connor, the future Lord of Ultramar would learn this lesson in the most brutal way possible. As gladiators fought and died for the entertainment of Macragge's elite, as wine flowed and nobles laughed at the spectacle of blood, a conspiracy reached its culmination. A blade found its mark. A good man fell, and in that moment of horror and rage, the young Primarch discovered that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the willingness to tear down everything you've known to rebuild it in righteousness. But that is merely the beginning of our tale, for the boy who would avenge his father's murder was destined for far greater trials. He would build the mightiest realm in human space, only to watch half his brothers turn traitor. He would crown another as emperor, only to be accused of treason himself. He would save the Imperium from collapse after the heresy, only to fall to a wound that would not heal. He would sleep the sleep of death for 10,000 years, only to wake in an age where his greatest creation had become a grotesque parody of itself. This is the complete story of Roboute, Guilliman. From the blood-soaked sands of a Macraggean arena to the golden throne of terror itself, from mortal prince to demigod of war, from living legend to martyred saint, from forgotten hero to humanity's last hope. It is a tale of how one man's vision of justice and order became the foundation upon which human civilization would stand or fall. Tonight, we follow the Avenging Son through every triumph and tragedy, every victory and defeat, every moment of glory and despair that forged him into the figure who would twice save the Imperium from destruction. We will witness the building of Ultramar, the horror of the Horus Heresy, the bitter necessity of Imperium Secundus, and the price paid for 10,000 years of peace. And at the end, when the galaxy burns and hope seems lost forever, we will see how the greatest of the Emperor's sons rises once more to remind humanity that even in the grim darkness of the far future, there can still be heroes. To understand the miracle of Roboute Guilliman's rise, we must first comprehend the darkness from which he emerged. The 30th millennium was an age of unprecedented expansion for humanity, yet it was built upon the ashes of the greatest catastrophe in human history. The age of strife had ended barely 2 centuries before, leaving scars across the galaxy that would never fully heal. For over 5,000 years, humanity had endured what scholars would later call Old Night. Warp storms of unimaginable fury had cut off star systems from one another, isolating human colonies in a galaxy suddenly full of predators. Without the guiding light of astropathic communication or the safety of warp travel, human civilization had fragmented into countless pocket empires, each fighting desperately for survival against Xenos raiders, daemon incursions, and the simple entropy of technological decay. Most worlds had fallen into barbarism. The standard template construct systems that had once provided every human colony with the tools of civilization had been lost or destroyed. Knowledge became a precious commodity hoarded by techno-barbarian warlords. Libraries burned. Forge complexes fell silent. The very stars seemed to have abandoned humanity to its fate. But not all worlds suffered equally in that endless night. Some few managed to preserve not just their technology, but their civilization itself. These worlds became beacons of hope in an ocean of despair, proof that humanity could endure even the worst catastrophes history could devise. Chief among these was a world on the eastern edge of what would become known as the 500 Worlds of Ultramar, Macragge. Even the name carries weight in the histories of the 42nd millennium. To speak of Macragge is to speak of order in chaos, of civilization triumphing over barbarism, of the human spirit refusing to bow before adversity. During the Age of Strife, while other worlds devolved into planet-spanning tribal warfare or fell beneath the boots of alien conquerors, Macragge maintained its advanced technological base, its educated population, and most importantly, its belief in the possibility of good governance. The world itself was a testament to human engineering at its finest. Orbital defense platforms ringed the planet like a crown of stars. Hive cities rose from fertile plains in perfect geometric harmony, their spires reaching toward the heavens while their foundations delved deep into the earth. Maglev transport networks connected every settlement with clockwork precision. Atmospheric processors maintained perfect climatic conditions across entire continents. But technology alone could not account for Macragge's success. What truly set this world apart was its people and their commitment to what they called the practical. This was not merely a philosophy, but a way of life, a systematic approach to governance that prioritized efficiency, education, and the common good over personal aggrandizement. Under the practical, leadership was earned through merit rather than birth. Decisions were made based on evidence rather than tradition, and the measure of any policy was not its ideological purity, but its practical results. At the apex of this system stood the office of consul, a position that combined executive authority with moral responsibility in ways that would have been familiar to the great republics of ancient Terra. The consul served not as an absolute ruler, but as the chief servant of the people, bound by law and constitution to serve the common good rather than personal ambition. In the years before the coming of the infant Primarch, this office was held by a man named Guilliman, and it was his vision that would shape not only Macragge but the young demigod who would bear his name. Connor represented the very best of the practical. He was a reformer who understood that good governance required constant adaptation to changing circumstances. He was a peacemaker who knew that true strength came from unity rather than division. Most importantly, he was a man who recognized that power existed to serve the people, not the other way around. Under Connor's leadership, Macragge had not merely survived the isolation of Old Night, but had thrived. Trade agreements with nearby star systems had created a small but prosperous network of allied worlds. Educational reforms had produced a citizenry capable of both independent thought and civic responsibility. Military innovations had created defense forces that could protect Macragge's achievements without becoming a threat to its freedoms. Yet this very success carried within it the seeds of conflict. Not all of Macragge's noble houses approved of the practical or its implications for traditional privilege. The old aristocracy, led by families whose power dated back to the earliest colonial settlements, chafed under reforms that elevated merit over bloodline. They whispered in the shadows about the proper order of things, about the need to restore ancient prerogatives, about the dangers of allowing the common people too much voice in their own governance. Chief among these traditionalists was a man named Gallen, whose noble lineage was matched only by his consuming ambition. Gallen represented everything that Connor's reforms sought to overcome. He believed in hierarchy for its own sake, in the divine right of the aristocracy to rule over their inferiors, in the necessity of maintaining social divisions that kept each person in their proper place. To Gallen and his allies, the practical was not enlightened governance, but dangerous radicalism that threatened the natural order of society. As Connor pushed forward with his reforms, expanding educational opportunities, creating new avenues for social advancement, and gradually reducing the power of the old noble houses, Gallen's opposition grew more desperate and more dangerous. Secret meetings were held in ancient family estates. Coded messages passed between conspirators who cloaked their ambitions in the language of tradition and stability. Gold changed hands as alliances were forged and loyalties purchased. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just the future of Macragge, but the character of the being who would soon fall from the stars to change the course of human history forever. The forces of progress and reaction, of innovation and tradition, of hope and fear, were gathering their strength for a battle that would be fought not with armies and fleets, but with daggers in the dark and poison whispered in trusted ears. And above it all, the warp storms that had isolated humanity for millennia were beginning to calm. Soon, very soon, golden ships would emerge from the void, bearing an emperor who sought to reunite humanity under a single banner. The Great Crusade was coming, bringing with it possibilities that would reshape the galaxy itself. But before any of that could happen, before the wider universe could intrude upon Macragge's carefully ordered existence, a small, strange pod was hurtling through the void toward this world of law and learning. Inside that pod, wrapped in blankets that bore the touch of the divine, slept an infant whose arrival would transform everything. The infant Primarch was falling toward Macragge like a meteorite of pure potential, carrying within his superhuman genetics the power to elevate human civilization to heights it had never imagined. But first he would have to survive the world he was about to enter. He would have to navigate the treacherous currents of Macragge's politics, earn his place in its society, and learn the lessons that would shape him into the leader humanity desperately needed. And the first of those lessons would be written in blood on the night when trust was betrayed and innocence died in the sand of an arena where men fought and died for the entertainment of their betters. The northern mountains of Macragge had witnessed many strange phenomena during the Age of Strife. Aurora displays that painted the sky in impossible colors. Meteorite showers that left crystalline deposits worth more than entire planetary economies. Atmospheric disturbances that could ground aircraft for weeks at a time. But nothing in recorded history compared to what the early morning patrol discovered on the slopes of Mount Ferris. The impact crater was perfectly circular, as if carved by some divine instrument rather than random celestial violence. The surrounding rock had been transformed into a glass-like substance that reflected the dawn light in prismatic cascades. At the center, partially buried in soil that still radiated warmth despite the mountain's eternal chill, lay a pod unlike anything in Macragge's extensive archives. The pod's surface seemed to shift between materials. At one moment it appeared to be fashioned from some unknown metal that gleamed like liquid starlight. The next, it resembled organic matter, pulsing with a rhythm that suggested life rather than mere technology. Symbols flickered across its surface in languages that predated human civilization, characters that hurt to look at directly, yet conveyed meaning beyond the reach of conscious thought. Captain Alexis Pollux of the Macragge Defense Force had seen enough battlefield anomalies to recognize something beyond normal human experience. His men, hardened veterans of countless skirmishes with pirates and Xenos raiders, stood at respectful distance while he approached the pod alone. The air around it hummed with potential energy that made his augmetic arm ache, and his combat instincts scream warnings he couldn't rationally justify. When the pod finally opened, it did so without sound or visible mechanism. The surface simply flowed apart like liquid mercury, revealing an interior that defied spatial logic. The chamber within appeared far larger than the pod's external dimensions could accommodate, lined with materials that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. And at its heart, cushioned by fabrics that felt like captured moonbeams, lay a child. But to call this being a child was to call a plasma reactor a candle. Even in sleep, the infant radiated presence that made grown soldiers step backward involuntarily. His features were perfect in a way that suggested divine craftsmanship rather than natural birth. His skin held a luminescence that had nothing to do with reflected light. Most unsettling of all, his eyes moved beneath closed lids, as if he were not truly unconscious, but merely choosing not to acknowledge the world around him yet. The journey back to Macragge Prime took 3 days through mountain passes that normally required a week's careful navigation. The infant never cried, never showed distress, never gave any indication that he was anything other than completely at peace with his circumstances. He ate when offered sustenance, though he seemed to require far less than any normal child. He slept for hours at a time, his breathing so controlled and regular that the medics checking his vital signs began to suspect their equipment was malfunctioning. Word of the discovery had already reached Consul Connor Guilliman through the Defense Force's standard reporting channels. But when Captain Pollux requested an immediate private audience upon reaching the capital, Connor knew this was no ordinary foundling child. The captain was not a man given to dramatic gestures or unnecessary urgency. If he deemed something worthy of the consul's immediate personal attention, then immediate personal attention it would receive. Connor's first sight of the child eliminated any remaining doubt about its extraordinary nature. The infant's eyes had opened during the final approach to the consul's residence, revealing irises of such deep blue they seemed to contain entire oceans. When those eyes met Connor's, the consul felt a recognition that bypassed rational thought entirely. This was no random survivor of some distant catastrophe. This was something far more significant. The child's development over the following months defied every known parameter of human growth. By his first week in the Guilliman household, he was sitting upright and tracking movement with eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. By his first month, he was walking with coordination that would have been impressive in a child 5 times his apparent age. By his 3rd month, he was speaking in complete sentences and asking questions that demonstrated not just linguistic ability but genuine curiosity about the world around him. Connor and his wife Tarasha had been blessed with a comfortable life, but had never been granted children of their own. The arrival of this extraordinary foundling seemed like divine providence answering prayers they had been afraid to voice. They named him Roboute after Connor's grandfather, a legendary figure who had helped establish many of the governmental principles that still guided Macragge's administration. But young Roboute was far more than even his adoptive parents initially realized. His physical development continued at an accelerated pace that would have been alarming if not for his corresponding emotional and intellectual maturity. By his 6th month, he stood as tall as children twice his age. By his 1st year, he was reading technical manuals and asking penetrating questions about governmental policy, military strategy, and social organization. What truly set Roboute apart, however, was not his superhuman development, but his character. Despite his extraordinary abilities, he displayed none of the arrogance or entitlement that might have been expected from such a gifted individual. Instead, he showed a genuine concern for others that went far beyond mere politeness. He remembered the names and personal details of every servant in the household. He inquired about their families and their concerns. He treated everyone from the senior advisors to the newest kitchen staff with the same respect and consideration. This combination of superhuman capability and profound empathy caught the attention of Macragge's political observers. The old noble houses, already suspicious of Connor's reformist agenda, began to view his adopted son with considerable unease. Here was a young man who could potentially inherit the consul's authority while possessing abilities that no normal human could match. The implications for their own power and influence were troubling in the extreme. Galen, whose opposition to Conor's reforms had been growing more vocal and more organized, saw in Roboute's arrival both opportunity and threat. On one hand, the boy's extraordinary nature could be used to fuel whispers about unnatural influences and dangerous precedents. On the other hand, if Roboute continued to develop as he had been, he would eventually become an opponent far more formidable than Conor had ever been. The young Primarch, though he did not yet know his true nature or destiny, began to sense the undercurrents of political tension that flowed through Macragge's carefully ordered society. His enhanced perception allowed him to observe micro-expressions and vocal inflections that revealed far more than their speakers intended. He noticed how certain nobles shifted uncomfortably when Conor spoke of expanding educational opportunities. He observed the carefully neutral faces that masked seething resentment when new anti-corruption measures were announced. He began to understand that not everyone shared his adoptive father's vision of a society based on merit rather than privilege. This political education accelerated as Roboute began accompanying Conor to various governmental functions. The boy's presence at state dinners and policy meetings was initially tolerated as an eccentric but harmless indulgence on the consul's part. However, as it became clear that Roboute was not merely observing but actually comprehending the complex dynamics of statecraft, some attendees began to feel distinctly uncomfortable under his penetrating gaze. The young Primarch's questions, posed with childlike innocence, but revealing adult-level understanding, had a way of cutting through diplomatic niceties to expose the underlying motivations behind various proposals. When Senator Malthorn suggested reducing funding for public education in favor of tax relief for property owners, Roboute asked why it would be beneficial for society to have fewer educated citizens. When Councillor Verson proposed relaxing environmental regulations to boost manufacturing output, Roboute wondered aloud about the long-term costs of pollution versus the short-term economic gains. These interventions, always politely phrased and seemingly naive, nonetheless had the effect of forcing politicians to defend positions they preferred to keep vague and unexamined. Gradually, invitations to events that included the consul's adopted son became less frequent among certain circles. The boy was developing a reputation as dangerously perceptive, someone who could see through carefully constructed facades to the ambitions and insecurities beneath. But Roboute's political awakening went beyond mere observation of adult hypocrisy. He began to understand the fundamental challenge that faced any society trying to balance competing interests while maintaining stability and justice. He saw how Conor's reforms, however well-intentioned, created winners and losers in the existing power structure. He recognized that change, even positive change, inevitably generated resistance from those who benefited from the status quo. More troubling still, he began to perceive the depths of resentment and desperation that motivated the opposition to his adoptive father's administration. Through overheard conversations and careful observation, he pieced together the existence of something more organized and more dangerous than simple political disagreement. There were secret meetings, there were coded communications, there were alliances being forged in shadow that had nothing to do with legitimate political discourse. As his second year in the Guilliman household progressed, young Roboute found himself caught between his natural inclination to warn Conor about potential threats and his growing understanding that direct accusations without concrete proof could backfire catastrophically. The political situation on Macragge was more delicate than most people realized. Open confrontation between the reformist and traditionalist factions could easily spiral into the kind of civil conflict that had torn apart so many other worlds during the Age of Strife. The young Primarch began to experience sleepless nights as he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. How do you protect someone you love from enemies who hide behind smiles and handshakes? How do you combat corruption that operates within the law even while subverting its spirit? How do you preserve justice and order when the very people entrusted with maintaining them are plotting their destruction? These were the thoughts occupying Roboute's superhuman intellect, as Macragge's political crisis moved inexorably toward its climax. The forces of tradition and progress were gathering strength for a confrontation that would determine not just the planet's future, but the character of the young man who would one day reshape human civilization itself. And in the shadows, Galen's conspiracy was preparing to strike at the heart of everything Conor Guilliman had built, unaware that their actions would forge their destroyer in the fires of loss and righteous fury. The Festival of Founding marked the anniversary of Macragge's first colonial settlement, and by long tradition it culminated in gladiatorial games held in the ancient Coronet Arena. These were not the brutal spectacles of less civilized worlds, but carefully choreographed displays of martial skill designed to honor the warrior traditions that had helped Macragge survive the age of strife. Combatants fought with blunted weapons under strict rules that emphasized technique over bloodshed. Victory brought honor and substantial monetary rewards, while defeat carried no shame for those who had fought with courage and skill. Consul Conor Guilliman attended every year, both from personal interest in the martial arts and from political necessity. The games provided an opportunity for him to be seen among the people, to demonstrate his commitment to Macragge's traditions, even as he worked to modernize its institutions. This year's festival held particular significance because it marked the 15th anniversary of his election to the consulship, a milestone that his supporters hoped to use as a launching point for even more ambitious reforms. Young Roboute, now in his third year with the Guilliman family and already displaying the physical development of a child twice his apparent age, had begged to attend the games. His fascination with military history and tactical theory made the gladiatorial displays irresistible, while his enhanced perception would allow him to appreciate subtleties of combat that escaped normal observers. Conor, proud of his adopted son's intellectual curiosity and confident in the arena's safety protocols, had readily agreed. The Coronet Arena was a masterwork of engineering that reflected Macragge's commitment to excellence in all endeavors. Its elliptical design provided perfect sight lines from every seat, while its acoustic properties ensured that even whispered conversations in the arena's center could be heard in the highest tiers. The sand covering the fighting floor had been specially treated to minimize dust, while providing secure footing for the combatants. Above it all, a retractable dome could protect spectators from weather while maintaining the open-air atmosphere that made the games so popular. The day's events began with preliminary matches featuring newer gladiators competing for the right to face more established champions. Roboute watched with intense concentration, his superhuman mind analyzing every movement, every tactical decision, every moment of hesitation or brilliance that might determine victory or defeat. He asked questions about weapon selection, fighting styles, and strategic approaches that demonstrated understanding far beyond his apparent years. Conor found himself equally fascinated by his son's analysis and by the gladiators themselves. Many of these fighters had volunteered for the arena as a path to social advancement, using their martial skills to earn enough prize money to establish businesses or purchase property. Others were retired soldiers maintaining their combat readiness while entertaining the public. A few were simply born warriors who found in the arena the only acceptable outlet for their aggressive instincts. As the day progressed and the matches became more elaborate, Roboute's attention began to drift from the fighting to the crowd around them. His enhanced senses picked up fragments of conversation from nearby seats, whispered exchanges that carried undertones of conspiracy and malice. He heard Galen's name mentioned in contexts that had nothing to do with legitimate political discourse. He caught references to timing, to opportunities, to actions that needed to be taken before certain deadlines. The young Primarch's growing unease was interrupted by the afternoon's featured match between Castor, a veteran gladiator known for his defensive expertise, and Thane, a younger fighter whose aggressive style had earned him rapid advancement through the arena's rankings. The crowd fell silent as the two warriors faced each other across the sand, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. What followed was a display of martial skill that captivated even Roboute's divided attention. Castor's patient, methodical approach created a chess match of move and countermove, while Thane's explosive attacks forced constant adaptation and improvisation. The fight lasted nearly 20 minutes, with momentum shifting repeatedly as each gladiator found ways to exploit their opponent's weaknesses while covering their own vulnerabilities. The match finally ended when Thane overcommitted to what should have been a finishing blow, allowing Castor to slip inside his guard and deliver a controlled strike to a non-vital area that would have been fatal with a real weapon. The crowd erupted in appreciation for both fighters, showering the arena floor with flowers and coins to express their approval of the display they had witnessed. But as the applause died down and attendants began preparing the arena for the final match of the day, Roboute noticed something that made his enhanced perception snap to full alertness. Several men in the crowd were not watching the gladiators or celebrating the conclusion of the match. Instead, they were focused entirely on the console's box, their eyes tracking Connor's movements with predatory intensity. The young Primarch tugged on his adoptive father's sleeve, trying to draw his attention to the potential threat without causing alarm among the other spectators. But Connor was engaged in conversation with Senator Malthorn about proposed changes to the gladiatorial regulations, and he dismissed Roboute's concerns with a gentle but distracted pat on the shoulder. The final match was scheduled to be an exhibition between two master gladiators, veterans whose skills had elevated them beyond mere entertainment to the level of living art. But as they took their positions on the arena floor, Roboute's attention was entirely focused on the men he had identified as potential threats. Their body language suggested imminent action, a tension that reminded him of predators preparing to strike. The signal to begin the final match came from a traditional horn blast that echoed through the arena's perfect acoustics. But instead of watching the gladiators, Roboute kept his eyes on the suspicious figures scattered throughout the crowd. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. These men were not random spectators, but part of a coordinated group, positioned to control key access points and sight lines throughout the arena. The young Primarch's superhuman reflexes were the only thing that saved Connor's life when the assassins finally struck. 3 crossbow bolts fired simultaneously from different sections of the crowd, their trajectories calculated to ensure that at least one would find its target, even if the others were somehow deflected. But Roboute's enhanced perception had allowed him to track the assassin's preparations, and his inhuman speed enabled him to react faster than any normal human could have managed. He threw himself across his adoptive father's body, just as the bolts converged on their target. 2 of the projectiles passed harmlessly overhead, but the third caught Roboute in the shoulder, its poisoned tip penetrating his superhuman physiology enough to cause immediate pain and disorientation. The young Primarch's agonized cry cut through the arena's acoustic perfection, alerting everyone present that something terrible had happened in the console's box. The chaos that followed was immediate and total. Security forces converged on the console's position, while spectators screamed and fled in panic. The gladiators abandoned their match to form a protective circle around the arena's center, their professional instincts taking over even in this unprecedented situation. Arena medical staff rushed to treat Roboute's wound, while Connor, shaken by his son's sacrifice and injury, tried to coordinate an effective response to the assassination attempt. But the young Primarch, despite the poison coursing through his superhuman metabolism, had not forgotten the lessons his adoptive father had taught him about the importance of justice and systematic investigation. Even as the medics worked to stabilize his condition, he was providing detailed descriptions of the assassins he had observed, their positions, their equipment, and their probable escape routes. The security forces' response was swift and professional, but it quickly became apparent that the assassination attempt had been carefully planned by people with intimate knowledge of the arena's layout and security protocol. The crossbow bolts had been fired from positions that provided maximum accuracy while minimizing the chances of immediate capture. The assassins themselves had vanished into the panicking crowd with practiced efficiency, leaving behind no obvious traces of their identities or affiliations. However, Roboute's observations provided investigators with leads that would have been impossible to develop through conventional means. His enhanced memory had recorded details about the assassin's appearance, equipment, and behavior that normal witnesses would never have noticed. His tactical analysis of their positioning revealed coordination that suggested extensive prior planning and professional training. The investigation that followed was methodical and relentless. Connor, shaken by how close he had come to death and motivated by rage over his son's injury, authorized unprecedented surveillance and interrogation protocols. Every person who had attended the games was questioned. Every vendor who had worked the event was investigated. Every security guard who had been on duty was subjected to intensive background checks. Gradually, a pattern began to emerge. Financial records revealed unusual payments made to several arena employees in the weeks leading up to the festival. Communication intercepts uncovered coded messages between known associates of traditional noble houses. Surveillance footage, analyzed with techniques borrowed from military intelligence, showed suspicious movements and meetings that painted a picture of extensive conspiracy. The trail led inexorably to Guilliman and his inner circle of traditionalist conspirators, but proving their involvement required more than circumstantial evidence and logical deduction. It required the kind of patient, systematic investigation that Roboute's enhanced intellect made possible. Working with his adoptive father's security forces, the young Primarch began to construct a comprehensive case that would expose not just the assassination attempt, but the entire network of corruption and conspiracy that threatened Macragge's stability. What emerged was a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Guilliman's faction had been planning not just Connor's assassination, but a complete overthrow of Macragge's constitutional government. They had been recruiting military officers, bribing civil servants, and establishing secret communication networks that would have allowed them to seize power in the chaos following the consul's death. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Financial records, intercepted communications, witness testimony, and physical evidence all pointed to the same conclusion. Guilliman and his allies had committed treason of the highest order, plotting to destroy the very foundations of Macragge's democratic society in service of their own ambitions and resentments. The trials that followed were conducted with scrupulous attention to legal procedure and constitutional rights. Connor, despite his personal involvement and emotional investment in the case, insisted that justice be served through proper channels rather than summary execution or political revenge. The evidence was presented methodically and thoroughly, giving the accused every opportunity to mount a defense while ensuring that the full scope of their crimes was revealed to the public. Guilliman's execution, when it finally came, was carried out with the same attention to legal propriety that had characterized the entire proceeding. But for young Roboute, watching from the gallery as justice was finally served, the real lesson was not about punishment, but about the price of allowing corruption to take root in even the most carefully constructed system of government. The assassination attempt had revealed vulnerabilities in Macragge's political structure that went far beyond simple security failures. It had exposed the dangerous potential for ambitious individuals to exploit legitimate political disagreements for treasonous purposes. Most importantly, it had taught the young Primarch that good government required not just good intentions, but constant vigilance against those who would corrupt and destroy it from within. This lesson would shape everything that followed in Roboute Guilliman's extraordinary life. The boy who had saved his adoptive father's life would grow into the man who would save human civilization itself, applying the same principles of systematic investigation, methodical planning, and unwavering commitment to justice that had exposed Galen's conspiracy to challenges that spanned entire star systems and threatened the survival of humanity itself. The morning that changed the course of human history arrived without fanfare or portent. No storms broke across Macragge's carefully regulated skies. No tremors shook the foundations of the planetary capital. The orbital monitoring stations detected nothing more unusual than a small fleet of vessels approaching from the edge of the system, their configurations unfamiliar but their energy signatures suggesting advanced human technology rather than Xenos threat. What those monitoring stations could not detect was the presence aboard the lead vessel of a being whose very existence defied the natural laws that governed mortal life. The Emperor of Mankind had come to Macragge drawn by psychic emanations that only he could perceive, following a trail of genetic resonance that had led him across thousands of light years to this prosperous world on the galaxy's eastern frontier. Conor Guilliman received the formal request for audience, with a mixture of curiosity and caution that had served him well throughout his political career. The delegation identified itself as representing the Imperium of Terra, a rapidly expanding human government that sought to reunite all of humanity's scattered colonies under a single banner. Their leader, they claimed, was the rightful ruler of the human species, a figure of such authority and power that entire star systems had voluntarily joined his cause upon merely witnessing his presence. Such claims might have been dismissed as the ravings of delusional megalomaniacs, if not for the evidence provided by their ships themselves. The vessels in orbit around Macragge represented technology centuries in advance of anything in the planet's extensive databases. Their hull materials absorbed sensor scans while radiating energy signatures that suggested power sources beyond current human understanding. More importantly, their very presence had somehow stabilized several persistent warp anomalies that had plagued the system's outer reaches for generations. Young Roboute, now approaching his 5th year on Macragge and already displaying the physical development and intellectual capacity of a young adult, persuaded his adoptive father to allow him to attend the formal audience. His enhanced senses and tactical intuition might prove valuable in assessing the true nature and intentions of these mysterious visitors. More importantly, something deep within his superhuman psyche was responding to the approaching presence with recognition that bypassed conscious thought entirely. The meeting was arranged in the Hall of Concordance, Macragge's most formal diplomatic venue. The chamber's architectural design reflected the planet's commitment to both grandeur and practicality, with acoustic properties that allowed every word to be heard clearly, while visual sightlines ensured that no participant could hide their reactions from careful observation. Ancient banners representing Macragge's greatest achievements hung from the vaulted ceiling, while holographic displays provided real-time data about the planet's current prosperity and stability. When the Emperor finally entered the hall, accompanied by a small retinue of warriors, whose very presence seemed to bend reality around them, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. This was clearly no ordinary human, regardless of his claims to represent humanity's interests. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his features perfect in a way that suggested divine craftsmanship rather than natural evolution. Most striking of all were his eyes, which seemed to contain depths of knowledge and experience that spanned millennia rather than mere decades. But it was the Emperor's reaction to young Roboute that confirmed what the boy had already begun to suspect about his own extraordinary nature. The moment their gazes met across the hall's polished floor, recognition flowed between them like an electric current. The Emperor's carefully maintained diplomatic facade cracked for just an instant, revealing joy and relief so profound that it transformed his inhuman features into something recognizably paternal. The formal presentations that followed were conducted with scrupulous attention to diplomatic protocol, but they were essentially irrelevant to the real purpose of the meeting. Connor spoke eloquently about Macragge's achievements and its commitment to human advancement. The Emperor outlined his vision of a galaxy united under human rule, free from the threats of alien predators and chaotic warp entities that had terrorized isolated human colonies for millennia. But both participants were really focused on the young man who sat quietly observing their exchange while radiating potential that both recognized as far beyond normal human capabilities. The private meeting that followed formal diplomacy was conducted in Connor's personal study, a chamber lined with centuries of accumulated wisdom in the form of legal texts, philosophical treatises, and historical analyses. Here, away from the ceremonial requirements of public discourse, the Emperor could speak more directly about his true purpose and the extraordinary nature of the young man he had come to reclaim. The revelation of Roboute's true origins was both shocking and strangely unsurprising. The Emperor explained the Primarch project, his attempt to create superhuman leaders who could spearhead humanity's expansion across the galaxy. He described the Chaos God's intervention, their theft and scattering of the infant Primarchs across the warp's treacherous currents. Most importantly, he spoke of his systematic search for his lost sons, a quest that had already reunited him with several of the scattered Primarchs. For Roboute, the Emperor's words provided answers to questions that had haunted him since his earliest memories of consciousness. His superhuman development, his instinctive understanding of strategic and tactical principles, his deep-seated need to organize and improve everything around him, all of these traits now made sense as expressions of his engineered nature, rather than random gifts of fortune. But the young Primarch's response to these revelations reflected the character that his years with Connor had shaped. Rather than immediately embracing his genetic destiny or rejecting his adoptive family, he asked carefully considered questions about the Emperor's intentions for Macragge and its people. He wanted assurances that his homeworld's prosperity and freedom would not be sacrificed to the greater glory of a galactic empire. He demanded guarantees that the values and principles that had made Macragge a beacon of civilization would be preserved and extended rather than discarded and forgotten. The Emperor's answers revealed both his pragmatic nature and his genuine respect for what Macragge had achieved. The planet would indeed become part of the growing Imperium, but as a model for other worlds, rather than a conquest to be exploited. Its governmental systems, educational institutions, and cultural achievements would be studied and replicated throughout human space. Most importantly, its people would benefit from the protection and opportunities that came with membership in a galactic civilization. The integration process that followed was remarkably smooth, aided by Macragge's existing prosperity and the Emperor's genuine appreciation for the world's achievements. Unlike many other planets that had required military conquest or extensive reconstruction, Macragge was already functioning at a level that met Imperial standards. Its technology needed upgrading rather than replacement, its government required coordination rather than revolution, and its military forces could be enhanced rather than disbanded. For Roboute, the most significant change was his introduction to the 13 Legion of Space Marines, the superhuman warriors who would become his primary instrument for expanding and defending the Imperium. These genetically enhanced soldiers had been created using his own genetic template, making them literally his sons in biological terms. But they were also professional warriors of extraordinary skill and dedication, veterans of campaigns that had already brought dozens of star systems into Imperial compliance. The young Primarch's first meeting with his legion was conducted aboard the flagship Macragge's Honor, a massive vessel that served as both warship and mobile headquarters for the 13 Legion's operations. The ship itself was a marvel of Imperial engineering, containing everything needed to support extended campaigns across multiple star systems. Its weapon systems could shatter planetary defenses, while its fabrication facilities could produce everything from ammunition to complete vehicles. Most importantly, its command and control systems could coordinate fleet actions across vast distances while maintaining constant communication with Imperial forces throughout the galaxy. The Space Marines of the 13 Legion had been expecting their reunion with their genetic father for years, but they were still unprepared for the immediate and profound connection that formed between them. Roboute's enhanced perception allowed him to read their emotional states and tactical thinking with unprecedented clarity, while their genetically programmed loyalty responded to his presence with an intensity that surprised even veteran Legion commanders. But the young Primarch's approach to commanding his legion reflected the lessons he had learned from Connor about leadership and responsibility. Rather than simply issuing orders and expecting blind obedience, he spent weeks studying every aspect of Legion operations. He interviewed individual Space Marines about their experiences and perspectives. He analyzed after-action reports from previous campaigns. He immersed himself in the tactical and strategic doctrines that had guided the Legion's operations since its founding. What emerged from this comprehensive analysis was a transformation of the 13 Legion's operational philosophy that would eventually reshape Space Marine warfare throughout the Imperium. Roboute recognized that while the Legion's existing tactics were effective, they could be made far more efficient through systematic organization and standardized procedures. He began developing what would eventually become the Codex Astartes, a comprehensive manual that would define Space Marine operations for 10,000 years. The young Primarch's first campaign as Legion commander was a carefully chosen engagement against a minor Xenos empire that had been raiding human colonies in the Macragge sector. The aliens had established fortified positions on several asteroid mining facilities, using their mobility and knowledge of local space to conduct hit-and-run attacks that conventional Imperial forces had found difficult to counter. Roboute's approach to the campaign demonstrated the analytical methods and systematic planning that would become his trademark. Rather than simply attacking the alien strongholds with overwhelming force, he spent weeks studying their tactical patterns and logistical requirements. He identified their supply lines, their communication networks, and their probable escape routes. Most importantly, he developed a comprehensive plan that would not just defeat the immediate threat, but eliminate the aliens' capacity to threaten human colonies in the future. The campaign itself was a masterpiece of coordinated operations that showcased the 13 Legion's enhanced capabilities under their Primarch's leadership. Instead of costly frontal assaults, Roboute employed simultaneous strikes against multiple targets, preventing the aliens from concentrating their forces or executing their preferred hit-and-run tactics. His careful coordination of fleet movements and ground operations eliminated the aliens' mobility advantage while forcing them into defensive positions where Imperial firepower could be most effectively employed. The victory was complete and decisive, but what truly impressed the Emperor and other Imperial commanders was the efficiency with which it had been achieved. The 13 Legion had suffered minimal casualties while completely eliminating a threat that had required significant Imperial resources to contain. More importantly, Roboute had demonstrated tactical and strategic capabilities that promised even greater achievements in the campaigns to come. But for the young Primarch, the real significance of his first victory lay not in military success, but in the confirmation that his vision of systematic organization and careful planning could indeed enhance human capabilities without sacrificing the values and principles that made such achievements worthwhile. He had proven that efficiency and effectiveness were not incompatible with honor and justice, that victory could be achieved without abandoning the moral foundations that separated civilization from mere barbarism. This synthesis of practical effectiveness and ethical responsibility would become the defining characteristic of everything Roboute Guilliman would build in the years to come. From the expansion of Ultramar to the development of the Codex Astartes, from his leadership during the darkest days of the Horus Heresy to his resurrection in humanity's hour of greatest need, the lessons learned in these early campaigns would guide every decision and shape every victory that followed. The success of Roboute's first campaign sent ripples of recognition throughout the expanding Imperium that reached far beyond mere military circles. Word spread among the scattered Primarchs that their newly discovered brother possessed capabilities that went beyond tactical brilliance into realms of strategic vision and administrative genius that few could match. The Emperor himself took particular notice of reports describing not just how the 13 Legion had achieved victory, but how they had done so while simultaneously improving the infrastructure and governance of every world they brought into compliance. This approach to conquest through construction, rather than destruction, became the defining characteristic of what Imperial historians would later term the Ultramar campaign. Unlike other legions that focused primarily on military objectives, the 13 Legion under Roboute's leadership treated each new world as an opportunity to demonstrate the benefits of Imperial civilization rather than simply its power. The transformation began with Calth, a mining world whose strategic location made it an ideal staging ground for further expansion into the Viridian sector. When Roboute's forces first arrived, they found a planet whose human population lived in conditions that barely qualified as civilized. The descendants of Age of Strife colonists had devolved into scattered tribes competing for control of automated mining equipment they no longer fully understood. Environmental degradation from millennia of unregulated extraction had rendered vast areas uninhabitable, while endemic warfare had prevented any meaningful technological or social progress. Most Legion commanders would have simply imposed Imperial rule through overwhelming force, established a compliant government, and moved on to the next target. Roboute chose a fundamentally different approach that reflected both his analytical nature and his deep understanding of the principles that had made Macragge prosperous. Rather than relying solely on military occupation, he deployed teams of administrators, engineers, and educators alongside his space marines. These specialists began the systematic work of rebuilding Calth's infrastructure, while simultaneously establishing the governmental and educational institutions that would sustain long-term prosperity. Mining operations were reorganized using modern techniques that maximized both efficiency and environmental protection. Trade routes were established to connect Calth with other Imperial worlds. Most importantly, the planet's population was gradually introduced to the technologies and concepts that would allow them to participate fully in Imperial civilization. The process took 3 standard years to complete, far longer than a conventional military conquest would have required. But when the 13 Legion finally departed Calth, they left behind a world that was not merely compliant, but genuinely prosperous. The planet's population had increased their standard of living dramatically, while gaining access to medical care, education, and economic opportunities that had been unimaginable under their previous circumstances. More importantly, they had developed the institutional structures and cultural attitudes that would allow them to maintain and expand these improvements without requiring ongoing Imperial oversight. Word of the cult's success reached other Primarchs through the regular intelligence briefings that kept the scattered legions informed of each other's activities. The reactions were mixed, but uniformly intense. Some, like Vulcan of the 88 Legion and Sanguinius of the 9, expressed admiration for Roboute's comprehensive approach to bringing worlds into compliance. They recognized that his methods, while slower than pure military conquest, created more stable and productive imperial territories. Others, however, viewed the Ultramar model with suspicion or outright hostility. Angren of the 12 Legion derided what he saw as weakness, disguised as sophistication, arguing that conquered populations respected only strength and would inevitably rebel against any ruler who showed them mercy, rather than dominance. Kurz of the 8th Legion took an even darker view, suggesting that Roboute's methods merely delayed inevitable betrayals while weakening the conquerors through misplaced trust in the conquered. But it was Lorgar of the 17th Legion whose reaction would prove most significant in the long term. The bearer of the word had initially approached the Great Crusade with religious fervor, treating each conquest as an opportunity to spread worship of the Emperor as a divine being. His methods emphasized conversion and spiritual transformation rather than mere political compliance. When Imperial forces under his command brought a world into the Imperium, they did so by establishing the Emperor as the central figure in local religious practice. The comparison between Lorgar's approach and Roboute's methods revealed fundamental philosophical differences that went far beyond tactical preferences. Where Lorgar sought to transform human consciousness through spiritual awakening, Roboute focused on practical improvements to material conditions and governmental structures. Where Lorgar emphasized faith and devotion as the foundations of imperial loyalty, Roboute relied on education and prosperity to create lasting allegiance. These differences might have remained merely academic, if not for the Emperor's increasingly obvious preference for Roboute's results over Lorgar's spiritual crusades. The worlds brought into compliance by the 13th Legion consistently outperformed those conquered by other legions in terms of productivity, stability, and voluntary cooperation with imperial directives. Their populations showed lower rates of rebellion, higher levels of technological advancement, and greater willingness to contribute resources to the broader imperial war effort. The contrast became particularly stark when imperial auditors compared the long-term performance of worlds conquered by different legions. Planets brought into compliance through pure military force required ongoing garrisons and constant monitoring to prevent rebellion. Worlds converted through religious indoctrination often developed fanatical loyalties that could be useful in warfare but proved problematic when those same populations needed to adapt to changing circumstances or new technologies. But worlds integrated through Roboute's comprehensive approach consistently exceeded imperial expectations for productivity and stability. Their governments functioned efficiently without requiring micromanagement from Terra. Their populations embraced imperial technologies and concepts enthusiastically, while maintaining the cultural distinctiveness that made human civilization rich and varied. Most importantly, they voluntarily contributed to the broader imperial project in ways that suggested genuine loyalty rather than mere compliance. The expansion of what was becoming known as the 500 Worlds of Ultramar accelerated as more systems requested integration into Roboute's growing realm. Word spread through merchant networks and refugee populations about planets where imperial rule meant prosperity rather than oppression, where human potential was cultivated rather than simply exploited. Entire star systems that had successfully resisted other imperial expeditions opened to negotiations with the 13th Legion, eager to experience the benefits that Ultramar's citizenship apparently provided. This voluntary expansion created administrative challenges that pushed even Roboute's extraordinary capabilities to their limits. Each new world required careful analysis to determine the most effective integration approach. Some planets needed infrastructure development before they could participate meaningfully in interstellar commerce. Others required educational programs to bring their populations up to imperial technological standards. A few demanded extensive governmental reforms to eliminate corruption and inefficiency that had accumulated over centuries of isolation. The solutions Roboute developed for these challenges would eventually become the foundation for imperial administrative doctrine throughout human space. He created standardized assessment protocols that allowed rapid evaluation of newly discovered human colonies. He established training programs that could quickly prepare local populations for participation in imperial institutions. Most importantly, he developed flexible governmental frameworks that could be adapted to widely varying local conditions while maintaining the efficiency and accountability that imperial administration required. But the true innovation of the Ultramar model lay not in any single administrative technique, but in its comprehensive integration of military, political, economic, and cultural factors into a unified approach to galactic governance. Roboute understood that sustainable conquest required more than military victory or political control. It demanded the creation of social and economic conditions that made imperial rule genuinely beneficial to the conquered populations while serving the broader strategic objectives of human expansion. This philosophy found its most complete expression in the development of what Roboute termed the practical idealism, a governmental theory that synthesized the best elements of Macragge's constitutions with the administrative requirements of galactic empire. The theory emphasized merit-based advancement, evidence-based policymaking, and systematic optimization of governmental efficiency, while maintaining democratic accountability and protection for individual rights. The implementation of practical idealism across the growing Ultramar realm created a model of human governance that even the Emperor found impressive. Reports reaching Terra described worlds where crime rates had plummeted, economic productivity had increased dramatically, and population satisfaction with imperial rule reached levels that seemed almost impossible given the coercive nature of most conquests. More importantly, these improvements proved sustainable even when the 13th Legion moved on to new conquests. The governmental institutions and cultural practices that Roboute had established in each world contained self-correcting mechanisms that prevented the gradual degradation and corruption that plagued so many other imperial territories. Local leaders understood both the practical techniques and philosophical principles that made their societies prosperous, allowing them to adapt and improve their systems as circumstances changed. As the Great Crusade entered its second century, and the number of human worlds under imperial control reached into the hundreds of thousands, the Ultramar model began to influence imperial policy at the highest levels. The Emperor instructed other Primarchs to study Roboute's methods and adapt them to their own operational areas. The Administratum began developing standardized procedures based on techniques that had proven successful in Ultramar. Even the Mechanicum expressed interest in the technological and industrial innovations that seemed to emerge naturally from worlds governed according to Roboute's principles. But this growing influence also created tensions that would have profound implications for the future of the Imperium. Other Primarchs, particularly those whose own methods had been implicitly criticized through comparison with Ultramar's success, began to view their brother's achievements with resentment rather than admiration. They whispered among themselves about favoritism and unfair advantages about the Emperor's obvious preference for one son over the others. These tensions came to a head during the Monarchia incident, when the Emperor personally censured Lorgar for the slow pace of his legion's conquests and the religious focus of his compliance methods. The humiliation was made more painful by explicit comparisons to Roboute's efficiency and effectiveness. Lorgar was ordered to study Ultramar's methods and implement similar approaches in his own operational area. The effects of this confrontation rippled through the entire Primarch Brotherhood, creating fractures that would ultimately prove far more dangerous than any external threat the Imperium faced. For while Roboute continued his systematic expansion of human civilization, building the foundations for a golden age that would span millennia, his brothers were learning lessons about jealousy, resentment, and the corrosive effects of comparison that would eventually tear the Imperium apart from within. The stage was being set for betrayals that would shake the galaxy itself, born not from alien malice or chaos corruption, but from the simple human emotions of envy and wounded pride. And at the center of it all, the architect of Ultramar continued his work, unaware that his very success was planting the seeds of the greatest catastrophe in human history. The first warnings came not through official Imperial communication channels, but through the informal networks of information that connected merchant captains, rogue traders, and astropathic guilds across the expanding Imperium. Whispered conversations in void station cantinas spoke of strange delays in compliance operations led by certain legions. Ships' captains reported unusual restrictions on trade routes that had previously been open to Imperial commerce. Most disturbing of all, refugee populations fleeing from supposedly pacified sectors carried stories that contradicted official reports of successful conquests. Roboute Guilliman's enhanced analytical capabilities made him more sensitive to these subtle patterns than most of his brother Primarch. His systematic approach to governance required constant monitoring of economic and social indicators across Ultramar, and these same monitoring systems detected anomalies in Imperial-wide data that suggested problems far beyond normal operational variations. The mathematical models that tracked resource flows, population movements, and communication patterns throughout the expanding Imperium should have shown steady improvement as more worlds came under Imperial control. Instead, certain sectors displayed statistical anomalies that suggested underlying instabilities. Trade volumes fluctuated wildly without apparent economic justification. Population displacement occurred in patterns that bore no relationship to the military campaigns supposedly causing them. Most concerning of all, astropathic communication traffic showed encryption patterns and routing changes that implied deliberate information suppression. These observations troubled Roboute, precisely because they defied logical explanation within the context of a unified Imperial expansion effort. The Great Crusade's success depended on coordination between different Legion forces, sharing of intelligence and resources, and consistent application of Imperial policies across all conquered territories. The anomalies he detected suggested that some legions were operating according to different priorities and different methods than those officially sanctioned by the Emperor. The first concrete evidence of serious problems came from the Growl system, a cluster of mining worlds that had been brought into Imperial compliance by the Sephitan Legion under Lorgar's command. According to official reports, the operation had been completed successfully within standard timeframes, with local populations accepting Imperial rule and beginning productive integration into the broader galactic economy. But refugees arriving in Ultramar space told a very different story. They spoke of cities razed not for military necessity but to make room for massive temple complexes dedicated to the Emperor's worship. They described forced conversion ceremonies that required entire populations to abandon their traditional beliefs and practices in favor of Imperial cult worship. Most disturbing of all, they reported systematic destruction of historical records, technological databases, and cultural artifacts that contradicted the religious doctrines being imposed by the word-bearers. Roboute's investigation of these claims required careful balance between his duty to support his brother Primarch and his responsibility to ensure that Imperial policies were being implemented correctly. He dispatched discreet intelligence-gathering missions to systems that had been brought into compliance by the Sephitan Legion, ostensibly to study their integration methods for potential application in Ultramar. What these missions discovered confirmed the worst of the refugee reports, while revealing additional problems that had not yet become apparent to outside observers. The worlds conquered by Lorgar's forces were indeed compliant in the sense that their populations offered no organized resistance to Imperial rule, But this compliance had been purchased through methods that systematically undermined the very foundations of the civilization the Great Crusade was supposed to be preserving and expanding. Local governmental structures had been replaced with theocratic hierarchies that prioritized religious orthodoxy over administrative efficiency. Educational systems had been restructured to emphasize religious indoctrination at the expense of technical training and scientific education. Most damaging of all, economic development had been subordinated to massive construction projects that served religious rather than practical purposes. The implications were staggering. Lorgar's interpretation of imperial compliance was creating worlds that were loyal to the emperor as a religious figure, but increasingly incapable of contributing meaningfully to the technological and economic advancement of human civilization. These populations might fight and die for their beliefs, but they could not innovate, adapt, or grow in ways that would sustain the Imperium's long-term expansion across the galaxy. Roboute's attempts to discuss these concerns with Lorgar himself proved frustrating and ultimately counterproductive. The 17 Primarch received his brother's observations with barely concealed resentment, interpreting legitimate policy questions as personal attacks on his methods and motivations. Lorgar argued that spiritual transformation was more important than material progress, that faith in the Emperor would provide whatever strength humanity needed to overcome any challenges it might face. More troubling still was Lorgar's suggestion that Roboute's focus on practical governance and material prosperity reflected a dangerous spiritual blindness that could ultimately prove more threatening to the Imperium than any external enemy. According to Lorgar's increasingly elaborate theological framework, the Emperor's divinity demanded absolute devotion and complete submission to his will. Any approach to imperial expansion that emphasized human achievement or rational analysis over divine worship risked corrupting the very souls of the people it claimed to serve. These philosophical differences might have remained manageable if they had been confined to private discussions between brother Primarchs. But Lorgar's methods were attracting attention from other sources within the imperial hierarchy, and that attention was increasingly critical. The Mechanicum complained that worlds conquered by the Scythian Legion consistently failed to meet their obligations for technological development and industrial production. The Administratum noted significant inefficiencies in resource allocation and administrative procedures on word-bearer worlds. Most seriously, the Emperor himself had begun to express concern about the pace and effectiveness of Lorgar's operations. The crisis came to a head with the Monarchia incident, a confrontation that would reverberate through the Brotherhood of Primarchs for decades to come. Monarchia had been the crown jewel of Lorgar's conquests, a world transformed into a massive shrine complex dedicated to the Emperor's worship. Millions of pilgrims traveled there annually to participate in religious ceremonies that supposedly demonstrated the highest achievements of human spiritual development under imperial rule. But when the Emperor finally visited Monarchia to personally assess Lorgar's work, his reaction was immediate and devastating. Rather than celebrating his son's devotion and the population's faith, the Emperor ordered the immediate destruction of every temple, shrine, and religious monument on the planet. He commanded the Word-Bearers Legion to kneel in the ashes of their greatest achievement, while he publicly censured Lorgar for wasting precious time and resources on superstitious nonsense when humanity faced extinction from enemies that could only be defeated through strength, knowledge, and unity. The humiliation was complete and absolute, made more painful by the Emperor's explicit praise for Roboute's methods and achievements. Lorgar was ordered to study Ultramar's governmental and administrative techniques, to abandon his religious focus in favor of practical conquest and integration. The implication was clear. The Thessatine Primarch had failed to understand the true purpose of the Great Crusade, while his brother had achieved success that met the Emperor's expectations. For Roboute, Witnessing his brother's public humiliation provided no satisfaction, despite his private concerns about word-bearer methods. He understood that the Emperor's harsh judgment was probably necessary to prevent further waste of Imperial resources on ineffective compliance techniques. But he also recognized that such a public confrontation would inevitably damage Lorgar's relationship with both the Emperor and his brother Primarchs in ways that could have lasting negative consequences. More troubling still were the reports that began reaching Roboute in the months following Monarchia about changes in word-bearer operations that seemed to go far beyond simple modifications to their compliance methods. Intelligence sources reported that the Ethetend Legion had begun operating with unusual secrecy, restricting access to their conquered worlds and limiting communication with other Imperial forces. There were stories of expeditions to systems that held no apparent strategic value, of excavation projects on dead worlds that served no obvious military purpose, of alliance negotiations with populations that other legions had classified as irredeemably hostile to human civilization. These developments suggested that Lorgar's response to the Emperor's censure had been far more radical than anyone had anticipated. Rather than simply abandoning his religious focus in favor of more practical methods, he appeared to be developing entirely new approaches to conquest and compliance that bore little resemblance to standard Imperial doctrine. The implications were troubling not just for the efficiency of future Thephatin Legion operations, but for the unity of command structure that made coordinated Imperial expansion possible. Roboute's attempts to investigate these changes more thoroughly were frustrated by the increasing isolation of word-bearer forces and the apparent unwillingness of other Primarchs to acknowledge that serious problems might be developing within their brotherhood. Most of his brothers seemed to view the situation as a private matter between Lorgar and the Emperor, something that would eventually resolve itself without requiring intervention from outside sources. But Roboute's analytical nature and his deep understanding of organizational dynamics made him increasingly convinced that the problems were more serious and more threatening than anyone else seemed to realize. The behaviors being reported suggested not merely tactical modifications or strategic experimentation, but fundamental changes in the Fistian Legion's priorities and loyalties. If those changes reflected genuine philosophical conversion rather than temporary adaptation, they could ultimately threaten the unity and effectiveness of the entire Imperial war effort. The tragedy was that Roboute's concerns were entirely correct, but his warnings were dismissed by those who should have taken them most seriously. The Emperor was focused on the broader strategic challenges of galactic conquest and apparently confident that Lorgar would eventually conform to his expectations. Other Primarchs were either unaware of the developing problems or unwilling to interfere in what they saw as family disputes between brothers. By the time the true scope of Lorgar's transformation became apparent, it would be far too late to prevent the catastrophe that was already taking shape in the shadows of the expanding Imperium. The seeds of the greatest betrayal in human history had been planted not in alien malice or chaos corruption, but in wounded pride and philosophical disagreement between brothers who had once fought side by side for humanity's future. And at the center of it all, the architect of Ultramar continued his systematic work of building the foundations for human civilization, unaware that his very success had become a catalyst for the destruction of everything he held dear. The message that shattered Roboute Guilliman's carefully ordered universe arrived through standard astropathic channels with routine encryption protocols that suggested nothing more urgent than regular operational updates. The transmission originated from the Istvan system, where Horus Lupercal's lunar wolves had been conducting what appeared to be a straightforward compliance operation against a rebellious planetary governor. Such operations had become routine during the Great Crusade's 2nd century, minor police actions that barely deserved the attention of a full Astartes legion. But when Roboute's communications specialists decoded the message in his private study aboard the Macragge's Honor, The content revealed events so unprecedented and horrifying that they initially seemed like elaborate misinformation designed to test Imperial security protocols. The report spoke of loyal space marines turning their weapons against their own battle brothers, of Primarchs ordering the systematic execution of officers who had served with distinction for decades, of virus bombs deployed against populations that had already surrendered and accepted Imperial compliance. According to the fragmented accounts provided by the few survivors who had managed to escape the Istvan system, Horus Heresy himself had orchestrated a massacre that defied every principle of honor and brotherhood that bound the Legionia Astartes together. The War Master, the Emperor's most trusted son and the architect of the Great Crusade's greatest victories, had apparently revealed himself as a traitor of such magnitude that his betrayal threatened the very foundations of the Imperium itself. Roboute's analytical mind immediately began searching for alternative explanations that could account for these reports without requiring acceptance of such a fundamental breakdown in Imperial unity. Perhaps the survivors had misunderstood what they witnessed during the chaos of battle. Perhaps enemy psychers had implanted false memories designed to spread confusion and demoralization throughout the loyal forces. Perhaps the entire affair was an elaborate deception intended to flush out real traitors who might reveal themselves by responding to apparent rebellion among the leadership. But as additional reports reached Ultramar from other sources, the evidence became impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. Merchant vessels fleeing the Istvan system carried similar accounts of betrayal and massacre. Astropathic communications intercepted from nearby sectors spoke of entire Legion fleets changing course without explanation, abandoning assigned objectives to converge on locations that served no apparent strategic purpose. Most damning of all, attempts to establish direct communication with Horus himself or any of his senior commanders were met with either silence or responses that seemed to come from different people entirely. The implications were staggering beyond imagination. If Horus had indeed turned traitor, he commanded not just his own legion, but significant influence over several other Primarchs who had served under his overall command during major campaign operations. The sons of Horus, Emperor's children, Death Guard and World Eaters represented nearly a quarter of the entire Astartes' strength, along with countless supporting Imperial army units, Mechanicum forces and Titan legions that had operated under War Master authority for decades. Even more troubling was the strategic position these potentially traitorous forces occupied within the broader Imperial expansion effort. Their combined fleets controlled critical warp routes that connected the galaxy's major sectors with Terra itself. Their conquered territories provided essential resources and recruiting populations for ongoing crusade operations. Most importantly, their commanders possessed detailed intelligence about Imperial defensive capabilities, operational doctrines, and strategic objectives that could prove devastating if turned to hostile purposes. Roboute immediately began implementing emergency protocols that he had developed years earlier as theoretical exercises in crisis management. Communication networks throughout Ultramar were placed on maximum security alert, with all routine traffic subjected to enhanced encryption and verification procedures. Military units were recalled from extended operations and concentrated around critical defensive positions. Most importantly, intelligence-gathering operations were initiated to determine the scope and nature of the apparent rebellion, while maintaining operational security that could prevent premature revelation of Ultramar's defensive preparation. But even as he marshaled his realm's defensive capabilities, Roboute found himself struggling with personal anguish that threatened to overwhelm his legendary emotional control. Horus had been more than just a brother Primarch or military superior. He had been a mentor and friend whose guidance had shaped Roboute's own development as a Legion commander. The War Master's tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership had provided a model for the kind of commander Roboute aspired to become. The possibility that such a figure could turn against everything they had built together challenged fundamental assumptions about loyalty, duty, and the nature of the brotherhood that bound the Primarchs together. The crisis deepened when direct communication was finally established, with loyal forces retreating from the Istvan system. Captain Garrow of the Death Guard brought word that the betrayal was far more extensive than initial reports had suggested. Multiple Primarchs had revealed themselves as traitors, coordinating their rebellion with a precision that indicated months or possibly years of secret planning. The massacre at Istvan III had been merely the opening move in a comprehensive campaign designed to cripple loyal forces while positioning the rebels for a direct assault on Terra itself. More horrifying still were Garrow's accounts of the corruption that had apparently infected the traitor forces. He spoke of space marines exhibiting physical mutations that suggested exposure to warp energies far beyond anything encountered during normal crusade operations. He described tactical doctrines that seemed designed to maximize civilian casualties rather than achieve military objectives. Most disturbing of all, he reported evidence of direct alliance between the traitor legions and entities that could only be described as daemons, supernatural beings that violated every principle of the imperial truth. For Roboute, this last revelation provided both explanation and additional horror. The imperial truth explicitly denied the existence of gods, daemons, and other supernatural entities, dismissing such concepts as primitive superstitions that rational enlightenment had made obsolete. If the traitor Primarchs had indeed formed alliances with warp entities, they had not merely turned against the Imperium, but against the very foundations of human rationality and scientific understanding. The strategic challenge this represented was unlike anything the Great Crusade had previously encountered. Conventional military doctrine assumed that enemy forces would operate according to logical principles, seeking to achieve recognizable objectives through rational means. But enemies who served supernatural powers with incomprehensible motivations could not be predicted or countered using normal analytical methods. Their very existence violated the natural laws that made strategic planning possible. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Roboute refused to surrender to despair or paralysis. His systematic nature demanded action based on the best available information, even when that information revealed threats beyond normal human comprehension. He began developing new operational doctrines that could function effectively against enemies whose capabilities and motivations remained largely unknown. These protocols emphasized flexibility over rigid planning, local initiative over centralized control, and multiple redundant systems that could continue functioning even if primary command structures were compromised or corrupted. The first practical application of these new approaches came when word reached Ultramar of a massive traitor fleet movement toward the Calth system. Intelligence suggested that the word-bearers under Lorgar's command were preparing to launch a surprise attack against one of Ultramar's most important industrial worlds. The timing was clearly intended to catch loyal forces off guard, while they were still reeling from the shock of the Istvan revelations. Roboute's response demonstrated both his analytical capabilities and his deep understanding of his brother's psychology. Rather than rushing to Calth's defense with maximum force, he implemented a carefully structured plan that would turn the traitors' assumptions against them. Calth would indeed be defended, but in ways that would expose the full scope of word-bearer intentions while preserving loyal forces for the larger conflict that was clearly approaching. The deception required tremendous personal discipline, as it meant allowing Calth's population to face genuine danger, while loyal forces prepared more comprehensive countermeasures. But Roboute understood that winning individual battles would be meaningless if the larger war was lost through strategic miscalculation. The traitors clearly expected their surprise attack to cripple Ultramar's industrial capacity while eliminating significant loyal forces. Instead, it would provide valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities while demonstrating that the 13th Legion could not be easily defeated or intimidated. As the Ultramar defense forces prepared for the coming battle, Roboute found himself reflecting on the broader implications of the crisis now consuming the Imperium. The Great Crusade had been founded on the promise that human unity and rational thought could overcome any challenge the galaxy might present. But the emergence of traitor forces allied with supernatural entities suggested that some challenges might indeed be beyond the reach of conventional human capabilities. Yet even faced with such overwhelming uncertainty, Roboute refused to abandon the principles that had guided his entire life. Honor, duty, and loyalty to humanity's best aspirations remained meaningful even when those who should have shared such values had revealed themselves as enemies. The systematic methods that had built Ultramar into a beacon of human achievement could be adapted to serve as weapons against those who would destroy everything civilization had accomplished. The battle for Khulft would test these convictions against the harsh realities of civil war, fought with weapons and tactics that violated every civilized norm. But win or lose, it would also demonstrate that some values were worth defending regardless of the cost, and that the foundations of human civilization were stronger than any single betrayal could destroy. The word-bearers were coming, bringing with them the full fury of powers that sought humanity's destruction, but they would find waiting for them a defense prepared not just with weapons and warriors, but with the unshakable conviction that reason, justice, and brotherhood could triumph even against the darkest forces the universe could unleash. The ruined storm changed everything. What had begun as isolated warp disturbances around the Eastern system rapidly expanded into a galaxy-spanning phenomenon that defied every known principle of astrogation and psychic science. Entire sectors found themselves cut off from Imperial communication networks, as the Imperium itself seemed to rebel against the natural order. Navigation became a nightmare of trial and error, with experienced navigators reporting warp currents that flowed in impossible directions and stellar phenomena that violated the fundamental laws of physics. For Roboute Guilliman, commanding the largest intact loyal force in the eastern galactic regions, the implications were staggering beyond immediate tactical concerns. The systematic communication networks that had allowed him to coordinate Ultramar's expansion and governance were now reduced to sporadic, unreliable fragments. Worlds that had been mere days apart in warp travel time became isolated behind barriers of chaotic energy that could take months or years to penetrate. Most critically, all contact with Terra and the Emperor had been severed at precisely the moment when unified Imperial response was most desperately needed. The strategic isolation was absolute and seemingly deliberate. Intelligence gathered from the few ships that managed to traverse the warp storms suggested that the phenomenon was not natural, but artificially generated through methods that combined advanced technology with psychic manipulation. On an unprecedented scale, the traitor forces had somehow weaponized the warp itself, using humanity's dependence on faster-than-light travel to fragment the Imperium into scattered pocket empires that could be conquered individually, rather than confronted as a unified force. But for Roboute, the most agonizing aspect of the situation was the complete uncertainty about the Emperor's fate and the status of the war effort beyond Ultramar's borders. The fragmentary reports that had reached him before the Room Storm's full manifestation painted a picture of catastrophic defeats and widespread betrayal throughout the Imperial forces. Horus commanded not just his own legion, but several other Primarchs whose loyalty had been revealed as a facade, hiding years of secret preparation for rebellion. In the face of such overwhelming uncertainty, most commanders would have focused entirely on defending their own territories while hoping for eventual restoration of contact with higher authorities. but Roboute's analytical nature and deep understanding of strategic principles made him acutely aware that passive defense would ultimately prove futile against enemies who controlled the initiative and possessed superior intelligence about loyal force dispositions. The solution he developed represented perhaps the most audacious and controversial decision of his entire career. If contact with Terra could not be re-established, and if the Emperor's status remained unknown, then the survival of human civilization required the creation of alternative governmental structures that could function independently while maintaining the essential principles of imperial rule. Ultramar would become the foundation for a second Imperium, a backup system that could preserve humanity's achievements even if the original centers of power fell to the traitors. The concept of Imperium Secundus emerged from countless hours of analysis and planning conducted in the deepest security chambers of the Macragge's honor. Roboute assembled his most trusted advisors and began developing governmental frameworks that could rapidly scale from managing the 500 worlds to coordinating the defense and administration of entire galactic sectors. The theoretical models they created drew heavily on Ultramar's existing administrative structures while incorporating lessons learned from the broader Imperial expansion. But theory remained meaningless without the political legitimacy that could transform desperate emergency measures into a functioning government capable of inspiring loyalty and sacrifice from the scattered loyal forces. Roboute understood that proclaiming himself emperor would be both morally wrong and practically counterproductive, regardless of his qualifications for leadership. The Imperium needed continuity with its founding principles rather than revolutionary change that could be interpreted as opportunistic power-grabbing. The arrival of Sanguinius of the Blood Angels provided both the legitimacy and the moral authority that Imperium Secundus required. The angel was universally beloved throughout the imperial forces, respected by all his brother Primarchs as the most noble and selfless of the Emperor's sons. More importantly, his apparent immunity to the corrupting influences that had claimed other Primarchs made him the ideal symbolic leader for loyal forces who needed to believe that their cause retained divine blessing despite the apparent triumph of evil. The private conversations between Roboute and Sanguinius that led to the formation of Imperium Secundus revealed the depth of both Primarchs' anguish over the current crisis and their shared commitment to preserving something meaningful from the wreckage of their father's dream. Sanguinius understood that accepting the title of emperor was both necessary for the survival of human civilization and a betrayal of his personal loyalty to the true emperor. Roboute recognized that his own role as the architect of this new government would forever mark him as either a savior or a traitor, depending on outcomes that neither of them could predict or control. The coronation ceremony held in Macragge's ancient amphitheater was simultaneously the most magnificent and most tragic event in Ultramar's history. Representatives from across the scattered loyal forces gathered to witness the formal establishment of a new imperial government that explicitly claimed authority over all human territories and populations. The pageantry was deliberately designed to invoke continuity with Terra, while establishing the legitimacy of the new administration. But beneath the ceremonial grandeur lay the terrible uncertainty that haunted every participant. They were creating a government that might prove to be humanity's salvation, or the final act of the Imperium's disintegration. If the Emperor still lived and eventually reclaimed his rightful authority, their actions could be interpreted as treasonous usurpation regardless of their good intentions. If he had indeed fallen and Terra lay in ruins, then they were the last hope for preserving the civilization he had sought to create. The practical challenges of governing Imperium Secundus immediately proved as daunting as the moral dilemmas it represented. Communication networks had to be re-established using alternative routing protocols that could function despite ongoing warp disturbances. Supply chains needed restructuring to compensate for the loss of critical manufacturing centers in territories now controlled by traitor forces. Most critically, military doctrine required complete revision to address enemies whose capabilities and motivations remained largely unknown. Roboute threw himself into these challenges with characteristic intensity, working virtually without rest to create administrative frameworks that could coordinate the defense of hundreds of star systems while maintaining the civilian governance that separated civilization from mere military occupation. The solutions he developed drew on everything he had learned during Ultramar's expansion, but adapted to conditions far more chaotic and threatening than anything he had previously encountered. The integration of Lionel Johnson and his Dark Angels into Imperium Secundus added both military strength and additional complications to the struggling government. The Lion's reputation as a brilliant but secretive commander was well established throughout the Imperial forces, but his methods and motivations often remained opaque, even to his closest allies. His arrival provided desperately needed reinforcement for the loyal forces, while raising questions about the ultimate objectives and loyalties of the coalition now forming around Macragge. The private dynamics between the three Primarchs revealed both the potential and the limitations of Imperium Secundus as a governed institution. Sanguinius possessed the moral authority and inspirational presence that could unite scattered loyal forces behind a common cause. Roboute contributed the analytical capabilities and administrative expertise necessary to transform abstract ideals into practical governance. The Lion brought military expertise and intelligence resources that were essential for effective resistance against the traitor forces. But their partnership also highlighted fundamental philosophical differences that made unified action increasingly difficult as the scope of their responsibilities expanded. Sanguinius was motivated primarily by loyalty to the Emperor and determination to preserve the moral principles that gave imperial rule its legitimacy. Roboute focused on practical effectiveness and the systematic optimization of governmental structures. The Lion prioritized military victory and the destruction of traitor forces, sometimes at the expense of broader political considerations. These tensions came to a head during debates over the strategic objectives that should guide Imperium Secundus policies. Should their primary goal be the preservation of existing loyal territories against traitor attack? Should they focus on gathering intelligence about conditions throughout the galaxy while preparing for eventual offensive operations? Or should they immediately begin aggressive campaigns designed to reclaim territory and rescue loyal populations trapped behind enemy lines? Each approach had compelling arguments in its favor, but each also required resource commitments and strategic risks that could prove fatal if circumstances changed unexpectedly. The uncertainty surrounding the broader war effort made it impossible to determine which approach would best serve the Emperor's interests or humanity's long-term survival. Yet delay and indecision could prove equally dangerous if they allowed traitor forces to consolidate their gains while loyal resistance withered from lack of coordination and support. The solution that eventually emerged represented a compromise that satisfied none of the participants completely, but provided a framework for coordinated action, despite ongoing disagreements. Imperium Secundus would simultaneously pursue defensive consolidation, intelligence gathering, and limited offensive operations, with resource allocation determined by ongoing assessment of changing strategic conditions rather than fixed, predetermined priorities. But as this new governmental structure began to function and expand its authority, disturbing reports reached Macragge that suggested the moral foundations of their entire enterprise might be more questionable than any of them had realized. Refugees arriving from distant sectors brought stories not just of traitor victories and loyal defeats, but of imperial forces whose methods had become increasingly brutal and desperate as the war progressed. The fight against chaos corruption was apparently producing its own forms of moral degradation that threatened to transform the defenders into mirrors of the enemies they opposed. Most troubling of all were accounts suggesting that similar emergency governments had been established in other sectors, each claiming imperial authority while operating according to their own interpretations of the Emperor's will and humanity's needs. If these reports were accurate, then the Imperium was fragmenting not just militarily but governmentally, with multiple competing authorities each believing themselves to be the true heirs to the Emperor's legacy. As Imperium Secundus consolidated its power and expanded its territorial control, the three Primarchs at its heart found themselves grappling with questions that had no clear answers and consequences that could reshape human civilization for millennia to come. They had created something unprecedented in imperial history, a government that claimed ultimate authority while serving a sovereign whose fate remained unknown. Whether their innovation would prove to be salvation or catastrophe remained to be determined by events that none of them could predict or fully control. The screaming began in the depths of the invincible reason, echoing through ventilation systems and bulkhead joints with a persistence that suggested something far more than mechanical malfunction or crew distress. Those haunting sounds carried undertones of anguish and fury that seemed designed to burrow into the consciousness of anyone who heard them, planting seeds of unease that would grow into full terror given sufficient time and isolation. Conrad Kurz had come to Macragge as a prisoner, though the circumstances of his capture remained deliberately vague in all official reports. The Night Haunter's arrival aboard Lionel Johnson's flagship had been presented as a fortunate opportunity to question one of the traitor Primarchs about enemy intentions and capabilities. But the reality was far more complex and troubling than the sanitized intelligence briefings suggested to most Imperium Secundus personnel. For Roboute Guilliman, the presence of his fallen brother represented both an unprecedented intelligence opportunity and a moral challenge that threatened the very foundations of the government he had worked so desperately to establish. Kurz possessed detailed knowledge of traitor force dispositions, strategic objectives, and operational capabilities that could prove invaluable to loyal defensive planning. But extracting that information required engaging with a mind that had been twisted by decades of exposure to the worst aspects of human nature and the corrupting influence of chaos powers. The interrogation sessions took place in the most secure chambers of Macragge's governmental complex, protected by both physical barriers and psychic wards that could theoretically contain even a Primarch's superhuman capabilities. But as the sessions progressed, it became increasingly clear that Kurz's greatest weapon was not his physical strength or tactical knowledge, but his ability to expose the moral contradictions and hidden motivations that drove even the most dedicated servants of the imperial cause. The Night Haunter's accusations cut to the heart of every doubt and uncertainty that had plagued Roboute since the establishment of Imperium Secundus. Kurz argued that the entire governmental structure was nothing more than an elaborate justification for personal ambition disguised as service to higher ideals. According to his twisted logic, Roboute had used the crisis of civil war as an opportunity to seize power that had been denied to him through legitimate channels, creating a rival empire that served his own ego rather than the Emperor's vision. These charges were particularly effective because they contained enough partial truth to make them difficult to dismiss entirely. Roboute had indeed created an alternative government that claimed authority independent of Terra's direct control. He had placed himself in a position of unprecedented power within that government, making decisions that affected the lives of billions of human beings across hundreds of star systems. Most troubling of all, he had done so based on assumptions about the Emperor's fate and imperial policy that could not be verified through any reliable source. But Kurz's most devastating attacks focused not on Roboute's actions, but on his motivations and the psychological dynamics that had driven his decision-making throughout the crisis. The Night Haunter argued that Imperium Secundus represented the logical culmination of attitudes and assumptions that Roboute had harbored throughout his career. According to this analysis, the Lord of Ultramar had always believed himself superior to his brothers in terms of administrative capability and strategic vision. The current crisis had simply provided an opportunity to act on those beliefs without the constraints that normal imperial hierarchy would have imposed. The accusations gained additional weight from Curz's detailed knowledge of Roboute's personality and history. The Night Haunter had observed his brother's methods and achievements during the Great Crusade, noting the subtle signs of pride and ambition that had motivated even Roboute's most altruistic actions. The systematic expansion of Ultramar, the development of the practical as a governmental philosophy, even the creation of the early Codex principles, all of these could be interpreted as expressions of a fundamental belief that Roboute's methods were superior to those of his brothers and deserved wider application throughout human space. The psychological pressure of these sessions was intensified by Curz's supernatural ability to perceive the future possibilities that flowed from current decisions and actions. The Night Haunter claimed to see visions of the ultimate consequences that would result from Imperium Secundus policies, prophetic glimpses of futures where Roboute's governmental innovations led not to salvation, but to the complete fragmentation of human civilization into competing empires that would eventually destroy each other through endless warfare. These visions were described in such vivid detail that they seemed to transcend mere speculation or psychological manipulation. Curz spoke of specific battles that would be fought decades in the future, of governmental institutions that would evolve into forms their creators never intended, of populations that would suffer and die because of decisions being made in Macragge's council chambers. The accuracy of his past predictions about the Horus Heresy's development made it impossible to dismiss these future visions as mere attempts at psychological warfare. The cumulative effect of these interrogation sessions was to undermine Roboute's confidence in every decision and assumption that had guided his actions since the crisis began. If Curz's accusations contained even partial truth, then Imperium Secundus might indeed represent a betrayal of the Emperor's trust and a fundamental departure from the principles that had guided the Great Crusade. The governmental structures that Roboute had created with such care and dedication could be nothing more than elaborate monuments to his own hubris and ambition. But the most insidious aspect of Curz's psychological assault was its impact on Roboute's relationships with Sanguinius and Lionel Johnson. The Night Haunter systematically exposed the tensions and disagreements that had developed between the three Primarchs, arguing that their partnership was fundamentally unstable because it required each of them to subordinate their own judgment to collective decisions that satisfied none of them completely. According to Curz's analysis, Sanguinius resented his role as a figurehead emperor who possessed ceremonial authority but lacked real power to shape policy according to his own moral vision. The Lion was frustrated by the constraints that collective decision-making imposed on military operations that required rapid response to changing tactical conditions. Most damaging of all, both of them harbored growing suspicions about Roboute's ultimate intentions and the possibility that his commitment to imperial restoration was subordinate to his desire to preserve and expand his own power base. These psychological insights proved devastatingly accurate in their assessment of developing strains within the Imperium Secundus leadership structure. Private conversations between the three Primarchs had indeed become increasingly tense as the scope of their responsibility has expanded and the pressure of making life-and-death decisions without clear guidance from higher authority took its toll on their judgment and emotional stability. The crisis came to a head during a formal council session where the three Primarchs were attempting to coordinate response to intelligence reports about traitor fleet movements in nearby sectors. What should have been a routine strategic planning meeting deteriorated into personal accusations and recriminations that exposed all the underlying tensions that Curz had so skillfully identified and exploited. Sanguinius questioned whether Roboute's recommended response to the traitor threat was motivated by genuine strategic necessity or by desire to expand Imperium Secundus' territorial control into sectors that had previously been outside Ultramar's sphere of influence. The Lion suggested that the entire governmental structure had become an obstacle to effective military action, creating bureaucratic delays and political complications that benefited the enemy more than the loyal forces. For Roboute, these accusations represented the culmination of weeks of psychological pressure and self-doubt that had been systematically cultivated through his exposure to Curses's twisted insights. The suggestion that his brothers no longer trusted his motivations or judgment struck at the very foundations of the cooperative relationship that made Imperium Secundus possible as a governing institution. The confrontation that followed was perhaps the most painful experience of Roboute's entire life up to that point. Three brothers who had once fought side by side for humanity's future found themselves questioning each other's loyalty and integrity at precisely the moment when unity was most essential for their mutual survival. The governmental structure they had created together began to collapse under the weight of suspicions and resentments that had been allowed to fester without adequate resolution. The immediate, practical consequence was the effective paralysis of Imperium Secundus' decision-making processes at a critical moment in the ongoing war effort. Strategic decisions that required coordinated action were delayed or abandoned entirely, as the three Primarchs struggled to rebuild trust that had been systematically undermined by external manipulation and internal contradiction. But the deeper consequence was Roboute's growing realization that Curses's accusations, however maliciously motivated, contained insights about the fundamental problems that plagued any attempt to create alternative governmental structures during times of crisis. The psychological pressures and moral ambiguities that had driven his own decision-making also affected every other person involved in Imperium Secundus operations. The same doubts and uncertainties that tormented him were reflected in the attitudes and behaviors of subordinates throughout the governmental hierarchy. This recognition led to perhaps the most difficult decision of Roboute's career. If Imperium Secundus had indeed become an obstacle to effective resistance against the traitor forces, and if its continued existence threatened to fragment loyal opposition rather than unite it, then the only honorable course of action was to dissolve the alternative government and restore unified command under whatever legitimate imperial authority could be re-established. The announcement of Imperium Secundus' dissolution was made during a formal ceremony that paralleled the coronation of Sanguinius in its symbolic significance, but where the earlier event had represented hope and determination to preserve imperial values despite overwhelming challenges, this ceremony carried undertones of failure and resignation that acknowledged the limitations of even the most well-intentioned governmental innovations. For Roboute personally, the dissolution represented both liberation and devastating loss. He was freed from the moral burden of wielding authority that had never been legitimately granted to him by the Emperor or any other recognized imperial institution, but he also abandoned governmental structures and administrative innovations that had represented years of careful planning and systematic development. The theoretical frameworks and practical procedures that could have transformed imperial administration throughout human space were deliberately discarded in favor of uncertain hope for eventual restoration of the original governmental system. As the last session of the Imperium Secundus Council concluded and the three Primarchs prepared to resume their individual roles as legion commanders rather than governmental leaders, Roboute found himself grappling with questions that would haunt him for the remainder of his extraordinary life. Had his attempt to preserve imperial civilization through alternative governmental structures been a necessary innovation that circumstances had forced upon him? Or had it been an expression of personal ambition that had ultimately served his own interests more than humanity's genuine needs? The answers to those questions would depend on events yet to unfold, decisions yet to be made, and consequences that none of them could fully anticipate or control. The journey to Terra began with hope born of desperation and sustained by determination that refused to acknowledge the overwhelming odds against success. After months of isolation behind the Runin Storm's chaotic barriers, the combined fleets of 3 Primarchs finally found navigable warp routes that promised passage to the heart of the Imperium. For Roboute Guilliman, leading the largest contingent of loyal Space Marines, still operating as an organized force, the prospect of reuniting with the Emperor and contributing to humanity's defense against the traitor assault provided purpose that had been missing since the dissolution of Imperium Secundus. But the galaxy they encountered during their tortuous passage toward Terra bore little resemblance to the expanding realm of human prosperity they had fought to build during the Great Crusade's golden years. Entire sectors had been transformed into war zones where loyalty and treachery could no longer be distinguished through conventional analysis. Worlds that had once exemplified imperial achievement now served as staging grounds for forces whose allegiances shifted according to the tactical requirements of conflicts that seemed to serve no recognizable strategic purpose. The systematic communication networks that had once connected every imperial world with Terra and with each other had been reduced to fragments that carried contradictory information about battles fought and victories claimed by armies that might or might not exist in the forms their intelligence reports suggested. Navigation itself became an exercise in interpretation as stellar phenomena that should have remained constant for millennia displayed variations that defied every known principle of astrophysics and warp science. Most troubling of all were the human populations they encountered along their route. These were not the confident citizens of an expanding galactic civilization, but refugees whose stories painted pictures of incomprehensible destruction and betrayal that had shattered every assumption about the fundamental stability of imperial rule. They spoke of space marines turning their weapons against civilian populations, of planetary governors declaring independence from Terra, while simultaneously proclaiming absolute loyalty to the Emperor, of imperial army units that had simply vanished from their assigned positions without leaving any trace of their fate or intentions. The pattern that emerged from these fragmentary accounts suggested a level of systematic breakdown that went far beyond the military rebellion that Horus had initiated at Istvan. The Imperium was not merely fighting a civil war between clearly defined loyal and traitor factions, but experiencing a complete collapse of the institutional structures that had made coordinated governance possible across galactic distances. Authority had fragmented into countless local hierarchies that claimed imperial legitimacy while operating according to their own interpretations of orders that might never have been issued by any recognized command structure. For Roboute, this realization carried implications that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. If the governmental and military institutions that he had spent his entire career strengthening and refining had proven incapable of surviving the stress of civil conflict, then the very foundations of imperial civilization were far more fragile than anyone had understood. The systematic approaches to administration and military command that had seemed so successful during the Great Crusade's expansion might have been effective only as long as they operated within conditions of relative stability and clear hierarchical authority. The first concrete evidence of Terra's true condition came through astropathic transmissions intercepted from Imperial forces that had managed to establish defensive positions in the Sol system's outer reaches. These communications painted a picture of siege warfare that had already lasted for months, with traitor forces systematically reducing the defensive installations that protected humanity's birthworld from direct assault. But even more disturbing than the tactical situation were the fragmented references to the Emperor's condition and the status of the governmental institutions that had coordinated imperial expansion from Terra's administrative centers. According to the most reliable intelligence available, the Emperor himself had been grievously wounded during personal combat with Horus aboard the traitor War Master's flagship. The exact nature of his injuries remained unclear, but the unanimous testimony from multiple sources suggested that he had been placed on some form of life support system that maintained his biological functions while preventing his active participation in governmental or military decision-making processes. The implications were staggering beyond any challenge the Imperium had previously faced. Without the Emperor's psychic presence to maintain the Astronomicon and enable reliable warp travel, human civilization would fragment into isolated planetary systems that could not support the technological and economic complexity that made imperial rule possible. Without his direct authority to legitimize governmental decisions, every institution from the High Lords of Terra to local planetary governors would lose the ultimate source of their power and legal authority. Most critically, without the Emperor's superhuman intelligence and strategic vision to coordinate the defense against chaos forces, humanity would face enemies whose capabilities and motivations remained largely beyond normal human comprehension, while lacking the unified command structure necessary to mount an effective resistance. The practical result would be the gradual but inevitable extinction of human civilization, as isolated pockets of survivors were systematically eliminated by forces that had already demonstrated their ability to corrupt or destroy everything they encountered. But when Roboute's fleet finally reached Terra and established contact with the surviving loyal forces, the reality of the situation proved even more devastating than the most pessimistic intelligence estimates had suggested. The throne world itself bore the scars of battles that had raged not just in the void around the planet, but on its surface and in the vast underground complexes that housed the Imperium's most critical administrative and technological infrastructure. The Emperor's condition was indeed as dire as the fragmentary reports had indicated, but the full scope of his incapacitation was apparent only to those who were granted access to the newly constructed Golden Throne. The massive life support system that now sustained him represented technology that stretched the limits of human understanding, combining advanced machinery with psychic amplification devices that channeled his remaining consciousness toward maintaining the minimal level of astropathic guidance that could prevent immediate civilizational collapse. For Roboute, the first sight of his father in this condition represented a trauma that would influence every subsequent decision of his extraordinary career. The Emperor, who had once embodied unlimited potential for human achievement and galactic expansion, had been reduced to a barely living relic whose continued existence depended on technologies that could fail at any moment. The dreams and aspirations that had motivated the Great Crusade now seemed like naive fantasies in the face of enemies who had proven capable of reducing even the master of mankind to such a helpless state. But the personal anguish of witnessing the Emperor's condition was overshadowed by the practical challenges that his incapacitation created for the surviving loyal forces. Without his direct leadership, the defense of Terra had devolved into a collection of independent commands that coordinated their activities through ad hoc arrangements rather than systematic planning. Different military units followed contradictory tactical doctrines while competing for limited resources and strategic positions that could not be optimally allocated without unified command authority. The political situation was equally chaotic, with various factions within the surviving governmental apparatus claiming authority to speak for the Emperor and implement policies in his name. These competing claims created administrative paralysis that prevented effective resource mobilization while generating additional conflicts that diverted attention and energy from the primary task of defending human civilization against its external enemies. Roboute's arrival with substantial military reinforcements and his reputation for administrative competence immediately placed him at the center of efforts to restore some semblance of coordinated leadership to the imperial war effort. But his attempts to implement systematic approaches to command and control encountered resistance from established authorities who viewed his methods as challenges to their own legitimacy and power bases. The root of the problem lay in fundamental disagreements about the nature and scope of the crisis that confronted the Imperium. Some factions argued that the current troubles represented a temporary setback that could be overcome through traditional military methods and restoration of normal governmental procedures. Others believed that the scale of corruption and betrayal required revolutionary changes to imperial institutions that would prevent similar catastrophes in the future. Roboute found himself advocating for a middle position that emphasized practical effectiveness over ideological purity, while maintaining the essential principles that had made imperial rule beneficial for the majority of human populations. His proposed reforms drew on everything he had learned during Ultramarre's expansion, and the brief existence of Imperium Secundus, adapting those lessons to the specific challenges created by the Emperor's incapacitation and the ongoing threat from Chaos forces. But implementing these reforms required political support from factions that remained suspicious of any Primarch's motivations and capabilities. The dissolution of Imperium Secundus had created lasting doubts about Roboute's ultimate loyalty to imperial authority structures, while his reputation for systematic efficiency made some officials fear that his reforms would ultimately reduce their own power and influence within the governmental hierarchy. The resulting political battles consumed time and energy that should have been devoted to military planning and resource mobilization for the critical campaigns that would determine humanity's survival. Instead of focusing on the external threats that had already demonstrated their ability to corrupt or destroy entire legions of space marines, the surviving imperial leadership found itself paralyzed by internal conflicts that served the enemy's interests more effectively than any military defeat could have accomplished. As the months passed and the strategic situation continued to deteriorate despite the reinforcements that Roboute and his brother Primarch had brought to Terra's defense, it became increasingly clear that the Imperium as it had existed during the Great Crusade was effectively dead. What would emerge from the current crisis would necessarily be something fundamentally different, shaped by the traumatic experiences of civil war and the permanent absence of the Emperor's direct leadership. The question that haunted Roboute during the long planning sessions and political negotiations that occupied his time on Terra was whether the new imperial structure that eventually emerged would preserve the essential values and aspirations that had made the original Great Crusade worth fighting for. Or would the necessities of survival in a hostile galaxy force humanity to abandon its highest ideals in favor of mere existence, creating a civilization that bore the name of empire while lacking the vision and purpose that had once made it truly great? The answers to those questions would depend on decisions that had not yet been made and battles that had not yet been fought. But as Roboute prepared to lead the great scouring that would determine the ultimate fate of human civilization, he carried with him both the systematic methods that had built Ultramar and the hard-won wisdom that came from witnessing the fragility of even the most carefully constructed human institutions when confronted with forces that sought their complete destruction. The Great Scouring had become something far more terrible than anyone had anticipated when it began as a systematic campaign to purge Chaos forces from Imperial territory. What had started as coordinated military operations to reclaim lost worlds had evolved into a galaxy-spanning hunt for traitors, heretics, and anyone whose loyalty might be questionable under the new standards that grief and rage had established. For 7 brutal years, Roboute Guilliman led these campaigns with the same methodical efficiency that had once built Ultramar, but now turned toward destruction rather than creation. The transformation in his approach to warfare reflected both the changed nature of the enemies they faced and the psychological toll that the heresy had exacted on everyone who had survived its initial phases. The traitor space marines, who had once been brothers, now fought with tactics and weapons that violated every principle of honorable combat. They employed daemon allies whose very existence challenged the rational foundations of imperial strategy. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to take particular pleasure in corrupting or destroying everything that the loyal forces sought to preserve and protect. Against such enemies, the careful restraint and precise application of force that had characterized Guilliman's earlier campaigns became not just ineffective, but actively dangerous. Worlds that might have been saved through negotiation and gradual rehabilitation were instead subjected to systematic purification that left little behind except the bare foundations upon which new imperial settlements could eventually be built. Populations that might have been re-educated and reintegrated into imperial society were instead classified as irredeemably corrupted and dealt with accordingly. The psychological pressure of making such decisions, repeated across hundreds of star systems over the course of years, gradually eroded the moral certainties that had once guided Roboute's every action. Each world cleansed of chaos influence required choices between competing values that all seemed essential to the Imperium's survival. Efficiency demanded speed and thoroughness that left no room for individual mercy or case-by-case evaluation. Justice required punishment for collaboration with forces that had sought humanity's extinction. But humanity itself seemed to require compassion and forgiveness that could restore meaning to the civilization they were fighting to preserve. The burden of command during the scouring was made heavier by the growing realization that the Imperium emerging from this crucible would bear little resemblance to the optimistic expansion effort that had characterized the Great Crusade. The governmental institutions that Roboute helped establish on Terra reflected the harsh lessons learned through betrayal and near extinction, rather than the confident idealism that had once driven human expansion across the galaxy. Security became more important than efficiency. Orthodoxy mattered more than innovation. Fear of corruption outweighed trust in human potential for improvement and growth. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of the scouring for Roboute, personally, was the gradual recognition that his own methods and attitudes had been fundamentally altered by exposure to the worst aspects of human nature and chaos corruption. The systematic analysis that had once sought optimal solutions for complex problems now focused primarily on identifying and eliminating threats. The comprehensive planning that had created Ultramar's prosperity was increasingly devoted to developing new ways to destroy enemies who might not reveal themselves until years or decades after their initial infiltration. The campaigns themselves took Roboute and his forces to battlefields that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality and the limits of human endurance. They fought in systems where the basic laws of physics had been altered by warp interference, where space marines could not rely on their equipment or their training to function according to established parameters. They pursued enemies through regions of space where time itself flowed differently, where memories could be implanted or erased by psychic phenomena that followed no comprehensible logic. Each victory in these impossible conditions came at costs that went far beyond simple casualties or material losses. The Ultramarines who fought through the scouring were gradually changed by their experiences in ways that would have profound implications for their future development as a chapter and their relationship with the broader imperial military structure. They learned to distrust their own perceptions and instincts when those conflicted with tactical doctrine. They developed reflexive responses to potential corruption that prioritized caution over heroism and suspicion over brotherhood. The systematic documentation that Roboute maintained throughout these campaigns would eventually form much of the foundation for the Codex Astartes, but the tactical principles it recorded reflected the harsh realities of warfare against supernatural enemies, rather than the optimistic assumption that rational analysis could solve any problem given sufficient information and careful planning. The codex that emerged from the scouring emphasized rigid adherence to proven procedures over creative adaptation, defensive formations over aggressive assault, and coordination with imperial authorities over independent initiative. But the most significant change in Roboute's approach to warfare came through his gradual understanding that victory against chaos forces required methods that were themselves potentially corrupting. The psychological techniques necessary to resist daemon manipulation could easily evolve into paranoia and isolation that undermined the very bonds of loyalty and brotherhood that made Space Marine operations effective. The tactical flexibility required to counter enemies who could alter reality itself sometimes demanded actions that violated the moral principles that justified the entire Imperial cause. This moral erosion became particularly apparent during the final phases of the scouring, when Roboute found himself making decisions that would have been unthinkable during the optimistic expansion of the Great Crusade. Entire populations were subjected to memory modification or genetic therapy to eliminate the possibility of future corruption. Worlds were rendered uninhabitable through systematic environmental destruction, rather than risk the spread of chaos influence to neighboring systems. Most troubling of all, loyal Imperial forces were sometimes sacrificed to maintain operational security or prevent information about Imperial capabilities from reaching enemy intelligence networks. The cumulative effect of these morally ambiguous decisions was to create a version of Roboute Guilliman, who retained his analytical capabilities and strategic vision while losing much of the idealistic optimism that had once made his achievements seem like natural expressions of human potential. The Primarch, who had built Ultramar as a demonstration of what humanity could accomplish through reason and cooperation, had become a general whose primary concern was preventing the complete extinction of human civilization through any means necessary. This transformation became most apparent during the campaigns in the Maelstrom region, where Roboute led a series of operations designed to eliminate the last major concentrations of organized traitor forces. The tactical challenges posed by enemies who could manipulate space and time required unprecedented coordination between different Imperial military branches while maintaining absolute security against infiltration or corruption. The solutions that Roboute developed for these challenges demonstrated brilliant strategic thinking, but also revealed the extent to which his priorities had shifted away from preserving human values toward ensuring human survival. It was during these final campaigns that Roboute encountered the weapon that would ultimately bring his active career to an end. The exact circumstances remain classified in Imperial records, but fragmentary accounts suggest an engagement with a daemon prince whose nature allowed it to wound even a Primarch's superhuman physiology in ways that conventional medical treatment could not address. The weapon employed against him carried chaos energies that actively resisted healing, while gradually spreading through his system like a slow-acting poison. The initial symptoms were subtle enough that Roboute could continue commanding the scouring operations, while Imperial apothecaries attempted to develop treatments for his condition. But as the months passed and the campaigns continued, it became increasingly clear that the wound was not responding to any known medical intervention. More disturbing still, the injury seemed to be affecting not just his physical capabilities, but his psychological state and his relationship with the broader Imperial command structure. The gradual weakening of his condition forced Roboute to accelerate the completion of several projects that he had been developing throughout the scouring. The most important of these was the comprehensive military doctrine that would eventually become the Codex Astartes, a manual that attempted to preserve the tactical and strategic lessons learned through 7 years of warfare against chaos forces. But the Codex also served a more immediate purpose, as a framework for Imperial military operations that could function effectively without requiring the direct involvement of a Primarch in day-to-day command decisions. The development of the Codex reflected both Roboute's systematic approach to problem-solving and his growing awareness that the Imperium needed institutional structures that could survive the loss of irreplaceable individuals. The manual's emphasis on standardized procedures and collective decision-making processes was designed to prevent the end of catastrophic leadership failures that had made the Horus Heresy possible, while preserving the tactical flexibility that had made the Space Marines effective against conventional enemies. But perhaps more importantly, the Codex represented Roboute's attempt to ensure that the moral and philosophical principles that had motivated the best aspects of Imperial expansion would not be completely lost, as the Imperium adapted to the harsh realities of a galaxy where chaos forces posed constant threats to human survival. The document's emphasis on honor, duty, and protection of civilian populations reflected his determination to preserve some measure of the idealism that had once driven the Great Crusade, even within the context of a military doctrine that acknowledged the necessity of sometimes brutal expedients. As his condition continued to deteriorate, and it became clear that his active participation in Imperial affairs would soon become impossible, Roboute began making the final preparations that would shape the Imperium's development for the next 10,000 years. The division of the Space Marine legions into smaller chapters was perhaps the most controversial of these decisions, but it reflected his deep understanding of the organizational dynamics that had made large-scale betrayal possible during the Heresy. The implementation of the Codex Astartes across all loyal Space Marine forces created a military structure that emphasized redundancy and distributed command authority, rather than the concentrated power that had made individual Primarchs so effective during the Great Crusade, but also so dangerous when their loyalty was compromised. The new system sacrificed some operational efficiency in favor of institutional stability that could survive the corruption or loss of individual leaders. But even as he worked to complete these final reforms, Roboute found himself grappling with the recognition that his own career had become a cautionary tale about the limitations of human achievement in a universe where supernatural forces actively sought the corruption and destruction of everything humanity had built. The systematic methods and rational analysis that had once seemed capable of solving any problem had proven inadequate against enemies who operated according to principles that violated the fundamental assumptions upon which human civilization was based. The irony was that his greatest achievement during the Scouring had been learning to fight effectively against such enemies, but that very success had required him to abandon much of what had made his earlier accomplishments meaningful. The Roboute Guilliman, who lay dying from a wound that would not heal, was a more effective military commander than the young Primarch who had built Ultramar, but he was also a harder and more ruthless figure who had sacrificed idealism for pragmatism and hope for mere survival. The silence that settled over Macragge when the life support systems registered Roboute Guilliman's final breath was unlike anything the world had ever experienced. For nearly 2 centuries, the planet had been the beating heart of the most prosperous realm in human space, its cities humming with activity as administrators, merchants, and diplomats from across the 500 worlds conducted the business that sustained one of the galaxy's greatest civilizations. Now that vibrant energy seemed to drain away as word spread that the architect of Ultramar had finally succumbed to wounds that had defied every attempt at healing. But death, it transpired, was not quite the end for a Primarch. Within hours of the medical pronouncement, the same life support systems that had failed to restore him to active consciousness began detecting residual biological activity that suggested something far more complex than simple cellular decay. The poison that had coursed through his superhuman physiology for months appeared to have reached some form of equilibrium with his enhanced metabolism, creating a state that resembled death while maintaining the minimal biological functions necessary to preserve his physical form. The senior apothecaries who had overseen his treatment immediately recognized the unprecedented nature of this condition. They had witnessed the deaths of space marines whose enhanced physiology allowed them to survive injuries that would have been instantly fatal to normal humans, but they had never encountered a situation where the dying process itself seemed to have been suspended indefinitely. The implications were both fascinating from a medical perspective and terrifying from a practical standpoint, as they raised questions about the nature of Primarch biology that had no ready answers within existing Imperial knowledge. The decision to place him in a stasis field rather than proceeding with normal funeral arrangements emerged from the collective judgment of Ultramar's Senior Leadership Council, a body that included both military commanders and civilian administrators who had worked closely with Roboute throughout his career. They recognized that his condition might represent an opportunity for future vertical intervention, while simultaneously acknowledging the symbolic importance of preserving his physical presence for the populations that had looked to him as both leader and inspirational figure. The construction of what would become known as the Temple of Correction required the mobilization of resources and expertise from across the 500 worlds. The architectural design reflected both the practical requirements of maintaining a stable stasis field for an indefinite period and ceremonial needs of creating a space that could serve as a focal point for the religious devotion that had begun developing around Roboute's memory even before his apparent death. The technical challenges involved in creating a sustainable stasis system for a Primarch's unique physiology pushed Ultramar's technological capabilities to their absolute limits. The engineers and tech marines responsible for the project had to develop entirely new approaches to energy management and environmental control while working within the constraints imposed by the gradual degradation of Imperial technical knowledge that had begun during the heresy. The solutions they eventually implemented represented innovations that would influence Imperial technology development for millennia to come. But perhaps more significant than the technical achievements involved in the temple's construction was the social and political transformation that began within hours of Roboute's apparent death. The governmental structures he had established throughout Ultramar were designed to function effectively without requiring his direct involvement in day-to-day decision-making, but the psychological impact of his absence created challenges that no amount of institutional planning could completely address. The immediate response from across the 500 worlds demonstrated both the strength of the bonds Roboute had created between Ultramar's diverse populations and the depth of personal loyalty that his leadership style had inspired among people who had never met him directly. Planetary governors, military commanders, and civilian administrators, who had been trained according to his methods, continued implementing policies and procedures exactly as they had been taught, but they did so with an intensity and dedication that reflected their determination to prove worthy of the trust he had placed in them. This loyalty extended far beyond simple adherence to established procedures. Throughout Ultramar, populations that had benefited from the prosperity and stability of Roboute's governance began developing religious practices that treated his teachings and example as sacred texts worthy of careful study and faithful implementation. The practical, which had once been understood as a philosophical approach to effective governance, gradually evolved into something approaching religious doctrine as communities sought to preserve and extend his legacy through increasingly elaborate ceremonial observances. The military response to Roboute's incapacitation revealed both the strengths and limitations of the organizational reforms he had implemented during the Scouring. The Ultramarines chapter, reduced from Legion strength according to the requirements of the Codex Astartes, initially struggled with questions of authority and command succession that had not been fully resolved before their Primarch's condition deteriorated. The systematic approach to military operations that the Codex mandated provided clear guidance for tactical and strategic decision-making, but it could not address the emotional and psychological void created by the loss of the gene father who had shaped their identity and purpose. The solution that emerged reflected the collective wisdom of the chapter's senior officers and the institutional culture that Roboute had cultivated throughout his career. Rather than attempting to replace his unique combination of strategic vision and administrative expertise with a single successor, the Ultramarines developed a collective leadership structure that distributed his various responsibilities among multiple specialists while maintaining unified command authority through carefully defined consultation and decision-making processes. This approach proved remarkably effective in maintaining both operational efficiency and morale throughout the difficult transition period that followed Roboute's apparent death. The chapter continued to fulfill its obligations to the broader Imperial military structure, while simultaneously taking on the additional responsibility of protecting and maintaining the Temple of Correction. The dual mission required careful resource allocation and strategic planning that demonstrated the enduring effectiveness of the methods Roboute had taught them. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the immediate aftermath was the impact on Imperial politics and the broader development of post-heresy governmental structures. Roboute's death removed one of the few remaining figures whose authority and expertise had been essential for coordinating the complex reconstruction efforts that the Imperium required. His loss came at a particularly critical moment when competing factions within the Imperial hierarchy were struggling to establish stable power-sharing arrangements that could function effectively without the Emperor's direct guidance. The news of his condition reached Terra through standard astropathic communication channels, but the response from the Imperial capital revealed the extent to which political dynamics had shifted during the years of warfare and reconstruction. Rather than prompting coordinated efforts to preserve his knowledge and experience for potential future recovery, his apparent death was treated primarily as an opportunity for various factions to claim portions of his authority and influence for themselves. The most immediate practical consequence was the effective abandonment of several major reform initiatives that Roboute had been developing in coordination with other surviving Primarchs and senior Imperial officials. Projects aimed at improving administrative efficiency, standardizing military doctrine, and establishing more effective coordination between different branches of Imperial government were simply allowed to lapse as the political coalitions that had supported them dissolved following his departure from active participation. But the longer-term implications were even more significant for the Imperium's future development. Roboute's systematic approach to institutional design and his deep understanding of the organizational dynamics that made large-scale governance possible represented knowledge and expertise that could not be easily replaced by other available personnel. His loss effectively ended any realistic possibility of implementing the comprehensive governmental reforms that might have addressed some of the structural problems that had made the Horus Heresy possible in the first place. The irony was that the very success of his earlier achievements made his absence particularly damaging to Imperial development during this critical period. The 500 worlds of Ultramar continued to function effectively according to the principles and procedures he had established, demonstrating that his methods could indeed create sustainable governmental structures. But the broader Imperium lacked both the institutional framework and the trained personnel necessary to implement similar approaches on a galactic scale. Instead, the Imperial response to the challenges of post-heresy reconstruction increasingly emphasized security and control over efficiency and innovation. The comprehensive reforms that might have created a more effective and resilient governmental structure were abandoned in favor of ad hoc measures designed primarily to prevent future rebellions, rather than to optimize Imperial performance. The result was an increasingly rigid and bureaucratic system that prioritized orthodoxy over adaptation and fear over hope. As the months passed, and it became clear that Roboute's condition was stable but showed no signs of improvement, the Temple of Correction gradually evolved from a medical facility into something approaching a shrine. Pilgrims from across Ultramar and beyond began arriving to pay their respects to the fallen Primarch, while the ceremonies and observances that developed around his memory became increasingly elaborate and formalized. The establishment of the Tetrarchs as Ultramar's governing council during this period represented perhaps the most successful adaptation to the loss of Primarch leadership that any imperial region achieved during the post-heresy reconstruction. These four senior leaders, trained according to Roboute's methods and committed to preserving his vision for human civilization, managed to maintain both the prosperity and the distinctive character of the 500 worlds, while adapting to changing circumstances that he could not have anticipated. But even their success served to highlight the broader failure of imperial institutions to benefit from the knowledge and experience that Roboute had accumulated during his extraordinary career. Rather than attempting to learn from Ultramar's example and adapt its methods to other regions of imperial space, the central government on Terra increasingly treated the 500 worlds as an anomaly that was useful primarily for the resources and military support it could provide to the broader imperial war effort. The pattern that emerged during this immediate aftermath would influence imperial development for the next 10,000 years. Roboute Guilliman's legacy was preserved and honored within Ultramar itself, creating a pocket of relatively effective governance and continuing prosperity within an increasingly dysfunctional galactic empire. But his broader vision of what human civilization could achieve through systematic application of reason, justice, and collective effort was gradually abandoned in favor of approaches that emphasized survival over growth and control over innovation. 10,000 years is a span of time that reduces individual human lives to statistical noise while transforming entire civilizations into archaeological footnotes. For most figures in human history, even the greatest emperors and conquerors, such duration would erase not just their personal memory, but any meaningful trace of their influence on the course of events. Yet the legacy of Roboute Guilliman proved remarkably resistant to the entropy that claimed lesser achievements, spreading its influence across the galaxy in ways that shaped human civilization long after his apparent death. The most immediately visible manifestation of this enduring influence was the implementation of the Codex Astartes throughout the Space Marine chapters that emerged from the post-heresy reorganization. What had begun as a practical manual for coordinating military operations gradually evolved into something approaching sacred scriptures as successive generations of chapter masters and senior officers treated its principles as inviolable doctrine rather than adaptable guidelines. This transformation from practical handbook to religious text reflected broader changes in imperial culture that would have disturbed Roboute greatly had he been able to witness them. The systematic rational analysis that had characterized his approach to military planning was gradually replaced by ritualistic adherence to established procedures that emphasized orthodoxy over effectiveness. Innovation became suspect, experimentation was discouraged, and deviation from approved methods was treated as potential heresy rather than tactical flexibility. Yet even this corruption of his original intent produced benefits that helped sustain the Imperium through challenges that might otherwise have destroyed it entirely. The standardization of Space Marine organization and doctrine created redundancy and interoperability that made the chapters far more resilient against the kind of systematic corruption that had enabled the Horus Heresy. When individual chapters did fall to chaos influence or alien manipulation, their standardized structure made it easier for loyal forces to predict their capabilities and develop appropriate countermeasures. The division of the original legions into smaller chapters also fulfilled its intended purpose of preventing the concentration of military power that could threaten imperial stability. Throughout the 10 millennia that followed Roboute's apparent death, no single military commander was ever again able to accumulate the kind of overwhelming force that Horus had wielded during his rebellion. The fragmentation of Space Marine strength created numerous centers of power that could check and balance each other while maintaining collective loyalty to the Imperial throne. But perhaps the most profound long-term consequence of Roboute's reforms was their influence on the broader imperial administrative structure. The governmental principles he had developed during Ultramar's expansion gradually spread throughout imperial space, not through deliberate policy implementation, but through the practical success they demonstrated in managing complex logistical and administrative challenges. Planetary governors and sector administrators who adopted methods derived from Ultramar's example consistently outperformed their peers in terms of resource management, population satisfaction, and resistance to corruption. This informal dissemination of administrative techniques created a network of relatively effective regional governments that helped preserve imperial civilization even as the central authority on Terra became increasingly dysfunctional. The bureaucratic apparatus that developed during the millennia following the heresy bore little resemblance to the streamlined efficiency that Roboute had envisioned, but it incorporated enough of his systematic approaches to maintain basic functionality across vast distances and diverse populations. The preservation of technological knowledge represented another crucial aspect of Roboute's lasting influence on human civilization. The standard template construct patterns and manufacturing procedures that had been carefully maintained within Ultramar served as repositories of technical expertise that could be drawn upon when other regions of imperial space lost the ability to produce essential equipment and systems. The 500 worlds became a crucial source of high-quality weapons, vehicles, and infrastructure components that supported imperial military operations throughout the galaxy. This technological preservation was particularly important because it maintained diversity within imperial manufacturing capabilities at a time when many other regions were experiencing the standardization and simplification that characterized the broader decline in human technical knowledge. The continued existence of Ultramar's advanced production facilities provided insurance against the complete loss of critical technologies while serving as a foundation for potential future innovation if circumstances ever permitted such development. The cultural impact of Roboute's legacy proved equally significant in shaping the development of imperial society over the 10,000-year span of his apparent death. The population of Ultramar maintained educational and cultural traditions that preserved literacy, scientific understanding, and philosophical sophistication at levels far above the galactic average. These traditions created a reservoir of human potential that could be drawn upon for crucial positions throughout the imperial hierarchy, as administrators and military officers trained according to Ultramar's methods consistently demonstrated superior performance compared to their counterparts from other regions. The religious transformation of Roboute's memory into an object of veneration created additional complications and benefits that influenced imperial development in ways he could never have anticipated. The worship of him as a divine figure provided psychological comfort and organizational focus for populations struggling with the harsh realities of existence in the 40th, but it also contributed to the broader theological evolution that gradually transformed the imperial truth into the fanatical religious orthodoxy that dominated later imperial culture. This religious development reached its most extreme manifestation in the creation of the cult of Guilliman, a sect that treated his writings and recorded sayings as divine revelation while interpreting his governmental methods as expressions of holy will rather than practical techniques. The cult's influence extended far beyond Ultramar itself, spreading throughout the Imperium as an alternative to the more extreme forms of emperor worship that emphasized mysticism and fanaticism over systematic analysis and practical achievement. The military legacy of the Codex Astartes evolved in directions that reflected both its strengths and limitations as a comprehensive military doctrine. Successive editions and interpretations of the text incorporated lessons learned through 10,000 years of warfare against enemies that Roboute had never encountered, but they also accumulated layers of tradition and ritual that sometimes obscured the original tactical principles that had made the system effective. The most significant evolution in Codex doctrine occurred through its adaptation to the unique challenges posed by different chapter homeworlds and recruitment populations. The flexible framework that Roboute had originally designed allowed for considerable variation in implementation while maintaining the core organizational principles that ensured interoperability between different chapters. This adaptability proved crucial as the chapters evolved to address specific threats and operational environments that varied enormously across the galaxy's diverse regions. The influence of Ultramar's governmental model on imperial political development created a complex legacy that combined positive innovations with systemic limitations that would plague the Imperium throughout its later history. The emphasis on merit-based advancement and evidence-based policymaking that had characterized Roboute's administration was gradually corrupted by the realities of managing a galactic empire without reliable communication or transportation networks. Regional administrators who attempted to implement Ultramar-style reforms often found themselves constrained by established power structures that resisted change and superior authorities who prioritized loyalty over competence. The result was a patchwork of governmental effectiveness that created significant disparities in living conditions and administrative quality across different regions of imperial space. But perhaps the most important long-term consequence of Roboute's career was its demonstration that human potential remained unlimited even within the constraints imposed by a hostile galaxy and supernatural enemies. The achievements of Ultramar provided a continuing example of what human civilization could accomplish when guided by rational analysis, systematic planning, and genuine commitment to collective welfare rather than individual ambition. This example became increasingly important as the millennia passed, and the Imperium faced challenges that tested the fundamental viability of human civilization in a universe dominated by alien threats and chaos corruption. The continued prosperity and stability of the 500 worlds served as proof that the original ideals of the Great Crusade remained achievable even under the difficult conditions that characterized the later imperial period. The preservation of this example required constant vigilance and dedication from the populations of Ultramar, who understood that their prosperity depended on maintaining the institutions and practices that Roboute had established, while adapting them to changing circumstances that he could not have foreseen. The success of this preservation effort created a living monument to his vision that influenced imperial culture in ways that extended far beyond formal governmental policies or military doctrine. As the 41st millennium drew toward its close and new threats emerged that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality and the limits of human endurance, the legacy of Roboute Guilliman remained embedded in the fundamental structures that sustained imperial civilization. His influence on military organization, governmental administration, technological preservation, and cultural development had created a foundation that proved remarkably resistant to the forces of entropy and corruption that had claimed so many other human achievements. But perhaps most importantly, his example had demonstrated that individual action could indeed have lasting consequences that shaped the destiny of entire civilizations. The systematic methods and principled leadership that had built Ultramar into a beacon of human achievement remained relevant and applicable even after 10,000 years of galactic conflict and social transformation. The foundations he had laid would prove essential when humanity faced its greatest crisis since the Horus Heresy itself, and the galaxy's need for his leadership became too urgent to accept his continued absence. The beginning of the end came not with dramatic fanfare, but through the gradual accumulation of failures that individually seemed manageable, but collectively represented the collapse of systems that had sustained human civilization for 10,000 years. The 13th Black Crusade emerged from the Eye of Terror with a coordination and purpose that dwarfed all previous chaos incursions, but what made it truly catastrophic was not its military strength, but its timing. The assault came at precisely the moment when the Imperium's ability to respond effectively had been degraded by millennia of accumulated dysfunction and resource depletion. Cadia, the fortress world that had anchored Imperial defenses against chaos for 10 millennia, fell not because its defenders lacked courage or skill, but because the fundamental strategic assumptions that had guided its construction and operation were no longer valid in the face of enemies who had evolved beyond anything the original architects had anticipated. The planet's destruction represented more than a tactical defeat. It symbolized the obsolescence of defensive strategies that had been developed during an era when the Imperium possessed resources and capabilities that no longer existed. The opening of the Great Rift that followed Cadia's fall transformed the galaxy in ways that made the original Horus Heresy seem like a localized disturbance by comparison. The massive warp storm that split Imperial space into two largely isolated regions created challenges that exceeded even the most pessimistic projections of Imperial strategic planners. Entire sectors found themselves cut off from Terra and from each other, while daemon incursions on unprecedented scales overwhelmed defensive systems that had been adequate against previous threats. But perhaps more devastating than the immediate military consequences was the psychological impact on populations that had maintained faith in Imperial protection despite centuries of gradual decline in living conditions and governmental effectiveness. The opening of the Great Rift demonstrated that the forces of chaos possessed capabilities that could fundamentally alter the physical structure of the galaxy itself, making human resistance seem not just difficult, but ultimately futile against enemies who operated according to principles that transcended normal understanding of cause and effect. For the defenders of Ultramar, watching these catastrophic developments from their relatively protected position within the 500 worlds, the crisis represented both vindication of their Primarch's long-term planning and a challenge that exceeded anything his defensive preparations had anticipated. The governmental and military structures he had established proved remarkably resilient against the direct effects of the Great Rift, but they also revealed their limitations when confronted with problems that required active intervention rather than passive resistance. The Tetrarchs who had governed Ultramar in Roboute's absence understood that their realm's continued prosperity would be meaningless if the broader Imperium collapsed entirely. The 500 worlds had been designed as a self-sustaining civilization, but they existed within a galactic context that provided essential resources, trade relationships, and defensive cooperation. The destruction of that broader context would eventually doom even the most carefully prepared regional government to isolation and gradual decline. But the challenge that confronted Ultramar's leadership went beyond simple strategic calculation to encompass questions about the fundamental purpose and meaning of their continuing efforts to preserve their Primarch's legacy. If the Imperium was indeed entering its final phase before complete collapse, then maintaining the illusion of effective governance might represent mere self-deception rather than meaningful service to human civilization. The systematic methods and rational analysis that had once seemed capable of solving any problem appeared inadequate against enemies whose very existence violated the logical principles upon which human civilization was based. It was within this context of seemingly hopeless crisis that the most extraordinary development in 10,000 years of Imperial history began to toll within the sealed chambers of the Temple of Correction. The arrival of Belisarius Cawl, the ancient tech priest whose projects had been developing in secret for millennia, represented the convergence of planning that had begun during the darkest days of the Horus Heresy, with technological capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what even the Mechanicum considered possible. Cawl's revelation that he had been working on methods for reversing Primarch stasis since shortly after Roboute's apparent death provided hope that seemed too extraordinary to accept even as desperate circumstances made it too valuable to reject. The technologies he had developed drew on knowledge that had been preserved from the dark age of technology while incorporating innovations that reflected 10,000 years of careful research and experimentation. But the most crucial element was not technological but biological, represented by the intervention of alien allies, whose motivations remained as mysterious as their capabilities. The Inari represented everything that Imperial doctrine had taught humanity to fear and distrust about alien species, yet their arrival offered the only realistic possibility of restoring the leadership that the Imperium desperately needed to survive its current crisis. The Eldar had been enemies of humanity for millennia, responsible for countless deaths and immeasurable suffering through their raids and manipulations. But they also possessed knowledge about the warp and its inhabitants that exceeded human understanding, while having their own compelling reasons for opposing the forces of chaos that threatened to consume the entire galaxy. The negotiations that preceded Roboute's attempted resurrection revealed the extent to which traditional Imperial attitudes toward alien species had become obstacles to human survival rather than expressions of necessary caution. The Inari's proposal required accepting alien assistance while acknowledging that human civilization alone lacked the capabilities necessary to address the current crisis. Such cooperation violated fundamental principles of Imperial doctrine, while representing the only available path toward preserving anything meaningful from 10,000 years of human achievement. For the senior officials of Ultramar, who had to authorize this unprecedented collaboration, the decision represented a choice between abstract, ideological duality and practical effectiveness that embodied all the moral complexity that had characterized their Primarch's career. The systematic analysis that Roboute had taught them suggested that cooperation with the Inari offered significantly better prospects for human survival than any alternative strategy available to purely Imperial forces. But such cooperation also required abandoning assumptions about human superiority and Imperial self-sufficiency that had sustained morale and organizational coherence throughout the darkest periods of Imperial history. The resurrection process itself combined technologies and techniques that spanned the entire history of galactic civilization, while pushing into realms of knowledge that no single species had ever explored independently. The ancient mechanisms within the Temple of Correction interfaced with Eldar psychic technologies and archaic human equipment in ways that created possibilities none of their original designers had imagined. The result was not simply the restoration of biological function, but something approaching a controlled miracle that defied conventional understanding of what was possible within the physical laws that governed normal existence. But even more extraordinary than the technical achievement was the psychological and spiritual transformation that accompanied Roboute's return to consciousness. The Primarch, who awakened after 10,000 years of stasis, was recognizably the same individual who had built Ultramar and codified Space Marine doctrine, but he had also been fundamentally changed by exposure to experiences that transcended normal human understanding of life, death, and consciousness itself. His first words upon awakening revealed both continuity with his previous character and awareness of changes that went far beyond simple temporal displacement. The analytical mind that had once sought optimal solutions to complex governmental and military problems remained intact, but it now operated within a framework of understanding that incorporated direct knowledge of the warp's nature and the supernatural forces that shaped galactic events. The systematic materialism that had once characterized his approach to problem-solving had been tempered by first-hand experience of realities that existed beyond the reach of purely rational analysis. The immediate practical challenges that confronted the newly awakened Primarch were staggering in their scope and complexity. The Imperium he had known was effectively dead, replaced by a grotesque parody that maintained the forms and rituals of his governmental innovations, while abandoning their essential purposes and principles. The Space Marine chapters that revered his codex as sacred scripture had evolved into something resembling religious orders more than military organization. Most devastating of all, The human populations throughout Imperial space lived in conditions that made the darkest periods of the Age of Strife seem like eras of prosperity and enlightenment by comparison. Yet rather than succumbing to despair or attempting to restore the past through revolutionary changes that could destabilize what little remained of Imperial civilization, Roboute approached these challenges with the same systematic methodology that had characterized his entire career. His analysis of current conditions acknowledged their severity while identifying opportunities for incremental improvements that could accumulate into meaningful progress over time. The governmental and military reforms he began implementing drew on everything he had learned during his original career while adapting to circumstances that his previous experience had never encountered. The development of the Primaris Marines represented perhaps the most visible manifestation of his ability to combine innovation with respect for established traditions in ways that strengthened rather than disrupted existing institutions. The enhanced Space Marines incorporated technological improvements that had been developing throughout his absence, while maintaining the organizational principles and tactical doctrines that had made the original Astartes effective across 10,000 years of warfare. The result was not replacement of existing chapters, but augmentation that enhanced their capabilities while preserving their distinctive identities and cultural traditions. The indomitous crusade that followed his resurrection demonstrated both the continued relevance of his strategic vision and the adaptations necessary to address enemies and challenges that had evolved far beyond anything he had originally anticipated. The systematic coordination of military forces across multiple sectors required communications and logistics capabilities that pushed Imperial technology to its limits while maintaining the flexibility necessary to respond to rapidly changing tactical conditions. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Roboute's return was its psychological impact on Imperial populations that had lived for generations without any realistic hope for improvement in their circumstances. The resurrection of a Primarch, who embodied humanity's greatest achievements, provided proof that the Emperor's protection had not been withdrawn entirely, while demonstrating that human potential remained unlimited, even under the most adverse conditions. The broader implications of his return extended far beyond immediate military and governmental considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of human civilization and its prospects for long-term survival in a hostile galaxy. The Imperium that Roboute had awakened to defend bore little resemblance to the optimistic expansion effort that had characterized the Great Crusade, but it also possessed resources and capabilities that his original efforts had never envisioned. The challenge that now confronted him was not simply restoring what had been lost, but creating something new that could preserve the essential values and aspirations that had made human civilization worth defending, while adapting to realities that made traditional approaches to governance, warfare, inadequate. The systematic methods that had built Ultramar would need to be scaled and modified to address challenges that spanned the entire galaxy while operating within constraints that reflected 10,000 years of accumulated limitations and dysfunction. Yet as Roboute began the immense task of reforming and revitalizing the Imperium, he carried with him not just the knowledge and experience gained through his original career, but also the deeper understanding that came from witnessing the consequences of his choices across 10 millennia of human history. The architect of Ultramar had returned not merely as a military commander or governmental administrator, but as a figure who embodied both humanity's greatest achievements and its capacity for redemption, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The story of Roboute Guilliman had become the story of human civilization itself, a testament to the enduring power of systematic thought, principled leadership, and unwavering commitment to the belief that reason and cooperation could triumph over chaos and despair. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was supposed to be only war, His return offered something that the galaxy had almost forgotten how to recognize: hope.